Chapter 1106. The poolside was quite lively. The past 3 days had been spent in complete leisure as the youths of Earth basked in luxury. None of them had realized just how much of a toll the war had taken on them until this moment. What was shocking to many of them, though, was that they hadn't been bothered at all. In fact, it didn't seem like anyone else was moving into their hotel either. It was as though the entire building had been locked down for their sakes. In the end, they could only brush it off and chalk it up to Noah and Lionel's performances. Maybe the Luxniks were still trying to figure out how to bring the two into their fold and as such made some concessions on the front end. Either way, the group had access to as much food and entertainment as they wanted. It truly felt like they were on vacation. That day, as the high sun began to calm a bit, a few dozen of them sat by the poolside. Gil, practically grinning ear to ear, had an arm wrapped around two ravishing beauties he seemed to be whispering sweet nothings to. The two would often roll their eyes and giggle, but so long as Gil didn't get too handsy, they let him do as he pleased. For Gil, this was enough for him to be on cloud 9. Just a few days ago he could only stare at beauties through a window pane. But now he could actually enjoy the touch of such slim waists with a single pinch. This was truly heaven. Ladies, you really should give me a chance. I might be fast, but I still know how to finish last. How could I call myself a gentleman without allowing two beauties to go ahead of me? Gil's gaze twinkled, his eyes sparking with crimson streaks of lightning as though to remind the two of his speedster status. The two women covered their mouths and laughed, but they gave Gil their usual non-answer. Your pickup lines are lame. Franco called over from the deep end of the pool. Gil snorted. Don't open that big mouth of yours too wide, you might drown. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, Franco sneered. I'm bigger than you in other places too, but I'll spare the beauties the shock. The two women in Gil's arms turned completely red toward Franco's frankness. Toward this, Gil could only be displeased. With a flick of his finger, Gil sent an arc of lightning toward the pool. Shit. Franco jumped, just barely getting out of the water before he was shocked. You little bastard. Franco snarled. Who are you calling little? Gil seemed to forget about the two women in his arms as he let them go to charge after Franco. Soon, their third battle of the day had erupted, leaving the two maids looking toward one another with speechless expressions. The laughter and ambience of the poolside didn't fade as the two fought. In fact, it only seemed to become livelier. Some even began to place bets on who would win this time. To the side, Noah sat in silence. By some miracle, he had been convinced to wear a pair of swimming shorts and his bold, refined chest was displayed for all to see. With how defined his muscles were, it would be difficult to pick a winner between him, Lionel and Alan. Though, as usual, Alan was wearing overly baggy clothing even by the poolside. Is there a problem with Lionel? Jessica, who was wearing quite a conservative one-piece swimsuit, tried to strike up a conversation with Noah once again. Somehow, though, every time Noah looked toward her, he would look away just as quickly as though he was seeing something frightening. Visit. For a better user experience, it was only after Jessica wrapped a shawl around her waist and partially covered her long, slender legs that Noah finally seemed to become normal again. No. I think he should be fine. Thinking back to what Noah had found on his bed 3 days ago, he assumed that Lionel must have received something as well. He was probably enthralled by it all. Cap. As though on cue, Lionel opened the side doors of the hotel to find himself by the poolside as well. Seeing that everyone was here, he couldn't help but smile. Yip. Little Blackstar hopped from Lionel's head, jumping toward the group of ladies who seemed to fall in love with him instantly. Clearly, they had no idea how much of a pervert the little guy was. You guys seem to be having a lot of fun. Seems I've missed out. Don't worry, Cap. I know you were just enjoying the presents we sent your way. Gil, who had Franco in a headlock, looked over with a mysterious grin. Lionel blinked in confusion. Presents? Yeah. Don't worry, Cap. Well, keep it a secret for you. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel was speechless. He had no idea that these guys had sent over some service women to his penthouse. But, long before they could even make it to his door, they had been intercepted by his mother. How could Eleanor allow her son to be serviced by such low-class women? Eleanor was all in favor of Lionel having dozens of wives, but they all had to be of the highest quality. He couldn't just wildly cede any plot of land. Lionel, though, had no idea about any of this and could only make some connections through the hardly disguised lewd gazes of his brothers. It was to the point even the women picked up on it, leaving them with no other choice but to turn their heads away in embarrassment. Lionel opened his mouth to explain but in the end just shook his head and sighed. He had to admit that he was a bit pent up. The stronger his body became as he progressed his metal body, the stronger those urges seemed to become. It also didn't help that he had been abstaining from such thoughts ever since Aina vanished. He shook his head again. What am I thinking? Gil's perversion is rubbing off on me? Still, who knows, with how big the event these 3 planets are planning seems, maybe Aina will be here too. Lionel was filled with a complicated emotion. How would he face Aina when he met her? He didn't like the idea of apologizing because he didn't feel like he had done anything wrong. Or, at the very least, he felt that they had wronged each other. Forget it, maybe as a man it was his duty to suffer a loss in this case. Who cared who was right or wrong as long as they could be together again? Wait, that was wrong too. If they approached things like that, the festering wounds that led to their separation in the first place would only grow, then they'd probably end up separated again. Lionel felt a headache coming on. At that moment, several strong auras suddenly converged on their hotel's poolside. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel looked up to see several youths making their way forward. All of them had a single thing in common. They shared the Luxnix bloodline. Chapter 1107. Lionel calmly observed these approaching figures. There weren't many of them and it also wasn't clear what their purpose was at a single glance. However, Lionel had some guesses. The peace could only last for so long. Their group had not only somehow monopolized an entire hotel and its amenities for themselves, but they hadn't even had to fight for it like the others had. Such branch family members wouldn't dare to find trouble with the main Luxnix family, so the next best option was to attack the root of their dissatisfaction to begin with. At first they were apprehensive. After all, some lingering rumors about what must have happened 3 days ago had circulated. Many thought that it wouldn't be long until members of the main branch came to usher Lionel and Noah in. If they made a move before that, wouldn't they be shooting themselves in the foot? But after 3 days of no movement, not to mention a few more rooms being claimed through competition, the other branch family geniuses seemed to realize that the Luxnix didn't have the intention of coming for Lionel and Noah now. Logically, it should only take an expert of the Luxnix a few hours at most to come here using a flying craft. If they used a teleportation formation, it would at most take a few minutes. 3 days was definitely too long even if potential delaying factors were taken into consideration. The fact that the Luxnix hadn't come more than likely meant that they were still waiting for Lionel and Noah to prove themselves. These branch family members had no way of knowing what the strength gauge for main branch members were. They only knew that Lionel and Noah were better than they were, but they didn't have a frame of reference for the main branch. This, along with the fact the matters of that day were only being spread by vague recollections, made solid deductions even more difficult. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience in the end, the other branch geniuses found themselves to be greatly dissatisfied. The youths of Earth hadn't even had to fight for their places. Since the Luxnix were clearly still testing them, didn't that mean that defeating them would gain them fame as well? At the helm, 3 youths with gazes that practically spit fire led the group. Though Lionel had no idea who they were, their auras were quite strong, all of them having stepped into Tier 7. Behind them there were a handful of Tier 5 and 6 existences. If Lionel was more informed, he would have known that these 3 youths were yet more members of the Luxnix top 10 branches. This time, rather than the 10th and 12th ranked, it was the 8th, 7th and 5th. The Luxnix family system worked quite simply. The main branch was located within this 3-pillar galaxy and shared the quadrants evenly with the Viola and Montex families. The branch families spread themselves throughout the sector. Some of the most powerful controlled entire galaxies of their own, while the weaker ones controlled several quadrants within a galaxy. A branch family's rank wasn't static and rather fluctuated. There were monthly, yearly, and per-decade rankings. This system stopped branches that were on top from growing complacent and also gave lower-ranking branches a chance to display their hard work and claim rewards. This ranking system was based on contribution. This included zones of note cleared, taxes paid, worlds conquered, and even additional elective contributions. These contributions were tallied and given scores that would eventually reflect in the rankings. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_g experience, of course, the more powerful families tended to have the better rankings and received the most support from the main branch. The 8th branch was known as the Muiter branch, the 7th the Unia branch, and the 5th the Cuvan branch. Though their rankings weren't as stable as the top 3 branch families, their confidence spoke volumes for itself given how boldly they had chosen to come here. What the hell is this? I spent all that time waiting, being held back for this? They're practically all in Tier 1, is this a fucking joke? The youth from the Unia branch, Kraka's Luxnix, wantonly swept his internal sight everywhere he pleased. Without even trying to hide it, he showed not a single person present a single ounce of respect. However, just before he could finish his sweep, Kraka's brows furrowed as he looked up to meet Lionel's gaze. Lionel himself stood where he had always been, his hands in his pockets and his gaze indifferent. The latest _IP_SODIES are on _the website. Kraka's lip curled into a sneer. He had been holding back before, but since this brat wanted to play. Without an ounce of hesitation, Kraka's unleashed his internal sight in full force, already imagining the sight of Lionel's internal sight shattering into shards of glass. Even though this would only leave the latter a bit dizzy for a few moments, he was already feeling a sick satisfaction from it. Great affinity with snow force, even without awakening the wisdom branch, made the internal sight of the Luxnix sturdier than most others. It had to be remembered the one had to take normal force to convert into soul force. With soul force one could project one's internal sight. However, some forces were far better in conversion than others were. Kraka's was confident in his own soul force, not only because of his Luxnix blood, but also because of his ability index. Whoever this fool was would suffer very soon. Unfortunately. Just as quickly as Kraka's sneered, he found his expression warping in the next moment. Lionel's internal sight was like a thick, impenetrable fortress. Kraka's could feel his own crumbling just after ramming into it. No, it wasn't crumbling, it felt as though just touching Lionel's internal sight made his slowly erode. The latest _IP_SODIES are on _the website. Right when Kraka's panicked and wanted to pull back, the form of Lionel's internal sight suddenly changed. From a fortress, it became numerous spiked ramrods, pushing forward with an air of lethality. Kraka shot backward to the very shock of his companions and retracted his internal sight as fast as he could. However, he was still a step slow. Kraka's body convulsed, his knees buckling as his face turned pale. He fell to the ground, his gaze somewhat vacant. Chapter 1108. From start to end, Lionel didn't move a single inch. In fact, those with weaker senses wouldn't have even been able to tell that a clash was occurring at all. It could only be said that Kraka's was too foolish. While he had snow force to strengthen his internal sight, Lionel had already awakened his wisdom branch to the second layer and his mind already had the boundaries and sturdiness of an individual at the quasi-sixth dimensional level. This had been the case long before he ever stepped into the fourth dimension, let alone now that he was in the fifth. As though that wasn't enough to widen the gap, Kraka's used regular soul force while Lionel used the purest form of soul force, dream force. With this disparity, even if Lionel only crudely controlled his internal sight, he would have still been able to crush Kraka's. But after being given the Luxnix library of techniques, Lionel had touched upon an entirely new level of internal sight control. The breadth of techniques the Luxnix had in this regard were impossibly numerous. Just now, Lionel had only used the most basic of third-dimensional internal sight manipulation techniques, and yet the difference was actually so striking. Of course, there was one other reason why the difference was so drastic, a reason related to the corrosive attack Kraka's felt true fear for. It could only be said that Kraka's had shot himself in the foot. Kraka's visit. For the best no_vil_NG experience, the members of the Unia branch that had followed rushed after Kraka's to help him up. The latter was still in a daze, but his cloudy eyes began to slowly sharpen, only for it to flash with a hint of seriousness and fear. He felt that if Lionel had insisted on pursuing him in that moment, his outcome wouldn't have been as simple as a spout of dizziness for a small while. He almost felt as though his mind could have been destroyed. Of course, Kraka's doubted that Lionel could really accomplish it. This wasn't because he was looking down on Lionel, he had already learned a lesson against that just now in the harshest way possible. The main issue was that internal sight that had been retracted into the mind couldn't be so easily messed with. In fact, trying to do so would have put Lionel in danger instead. The leading youth of the Muiter and Cuvan branches looked back toward Kraka's with equally serious expressions. They had been paying attention to what happened just now. Usually, internal sight was quite fluid. Several internal sights could overlap and pass through one another without issue normally. However, techniques for internal sight taking shape and form like that were extraordinarily rare, and those who had such proficiency in them were even rarer. It almost felt like a perfect one-to-one of Lionel's consciousness. Of course, they had no idea that it was exactly this. With Dream Force, Lionel's control of his internal sight was a thought away. After all, Dream Force was the embodiment of consciousness. So you were a specialist of the Wisdom branch. It seems we've underestimated you. Nigrith, the Tier 7 youth of the 5th-ranked Cuvan branch, looked toward Lionel deeply, his tone and expression touched with a hint of seriousness. The latest _p_sodies are on the website. The Wisdom branch was probably the most respected of the Snowy Star Owl's 3 main talent branches. The Luxnix had a saying that it was from wisdom that all other things sprout. Those who specialized in the Wisdom branch had statuses that were a margin higher than those who were of the Speed or Healing branch. However, that was all. This wasn't enough for these youths to back down. It had only taught them that they shouldn't get into a war of internal sight with Lionel. Seeing that they had come to such a conclusion, Lionel didn't bother to correct them. There wasn't much of a point. It likely wouldn't be long before they learned the true extent of his abilities. Might I ask what you 3 have come for? Lionel smiled lightly, however his brothers had already snapped out of their fun-having state to stare toward the newcomers. Ridden, the final Tier 7 youth of the Muiter branch, looked Lionel up and down, his fists itching. For some reason, Lionel's smile reminded him of the hypocritical smiles of all those old fogies. But, for other reasons, he couldn't seem to bring himself to hate it as much. We came for battle, of course. He spoke out, taking a step forward. In all this time, the other branches have been competing every day for the sake of the resources they get to enjoy. Your hotel still has 100% of its maid servants, amenities and food. Yet you're the only group that has yet to fight a single battle. It seemed that the competition didn't stop at claiming rooms. After this, it became a contest of the hotels and a fight for resources. Visit. For the best experience I see. Lionel nodded. So you want our resources? Aside from the obvious, why's that? Lionel calmly observed the group before him. Ridden's sneer deepened. None of us know when the competition will begin. Isn't it only right that we try to gather up as many resources as we can to improve in what time we have left? If we can sharpen our skills against good sparring partners, wouldn't that be even better? Lionel nodded. That did indeed make sense. He had hoped to learn more about this competition, but he guessed that this much was already enough. He gazed toward everyone around him and laughed. Well, you all heard him, they want to spar for resources. I haven't eaten in quite a few days, you guys have fun. Lionel's feet glided against the grass and eventual polished stone surrounding the poolside. Under everyone's gazes, he made it to the barbecue and started fixing himself an enormous plate of food. Whether it was the youths of Earth or the branch youths, they could only stand and watch, speechless. Visit. For the best experience before any of them had reacted, Lionel had already begun to munch on an enormous beast leg. He looked up with an innocent expression on his face. What are you all waiting for? They only came with 9 people, there are over 50 of us. Gang up on them. Chapter 1109. Shameless. Lionel looked up from his plate of food to see an enormous battle royale having broken out. Whether it was Crocus, Nigrith or Ridden or even their followers, all of them were instantly infuriated. However, toward this reaction, Lionel could only shrug. Though Crocus was a bit rude in his remarks, that didn't mean he wasn't correct. The youths of Earth were indeed far too weak. Even the most advanced of them was only at Tier 2 and that happened to be Noah. Lionel himself would likely break into Tier 2 in a few days thanks to the benefits of, but compared to these Tier 5, 6 and 7 youths, it was really not worth mentioning. The worst part was that Lionel was fully aware that this was just the tip of the iceberg. He still remembered that Raya girl from a few days ago. She was already Tier 8 and her talent itself was far beyond the youths that had come here today. And these were all branch family members. If the difference between them and the branch families was already this large, what about the difference between them and the main branch? What about the other 2 pillar families, the Viola and the Montex? Lionel vaguely felt that maybe bringing everyone here was a mistake, but in the end he shook his head. What good was it if they stayed sheltered? Facing the world like this would only help them improve faster. Why am I thinking like some old man? I need to improve too. Lionel took another large bite out of his food, his gaze scanning the battlefield. From just a cursory glance, he could tell that it took on average 3 of Earth's geniuses to face just one of them. The difference was there for all to see. Visit. For a better user experience in truth, this revelation was more shocking than not for the branch family geniuses. The gap between experts of the 5th dimension were enormous, especially if it was the gap of 1 or 2 watersheds. There were 3 higher tier geniuses and 6 middle tier geniuses, while all of Earth's youths were still in the lower tier. The fact that it only took 3 to bridge this gap was more shocking than anything else. To put this matter into perspective, even if they had to fight 50 Tier 1 experts alone, they should have been able to do it. If these Tier 1 experts were from lesser worlds, even hundreds to thousands of them shouldn't have been able to bridge the gap. The fact that 3 could was shocking enough. Still, Lionel could only sigh at this result. He wasn't quite sure of what to do. Should he use the money his mother left him to help? No. That wouldn't make much of a difference. The accommodations the hotel provided were excellent. They had all the nutrients and support fifth-dimensional existences could ask for. Should he use the silver tablet to help loosen their bottlenecks? This was a possibility, but, having learned about the three-finger cult, Lionel realized that his past acts of openly and freely using the silver tablet was far more dangerous than he knew. He had only done so because he thought he was the only one potentially aware of its existence, but clearly this wasn't the case. Realizing this, Lionel knew that he couldn't casually rely on the silver tablet any longer, at least not for people he didn't have absolute trust in. He would trust his brothers with his life, but he barely had a surface relationship with the other youths of Earth. He didn't have the luxury of freely believing in them. Hold this USOB. Raj swung down a massive hammer of metallic sand. His violent movements caused that layers of fat that coated his body to peel backward and press down, surprisingly revealing the hint of a powerful physique. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. This wasn't too surprising to the others. Before the metamorphosis, the strongest of them all in terms of raw power was most definitely between Raj and Arnold. It was too bad he refused to lose weight even after no longer needing it for football. Lionel smiled as he watched them all push the branch family geniuses back. His gaze slowly left the battle, aiming up toward a distant hotel roof. It's him? Did he see us? So what if he did? Another responded with a yawn. Isn't this a bit too shameless? We should just storm down there and end it all. By the time we're finished, they won't have a place here any longer. Maybe, but it's interesting, don't you think? What the hell is interesting about these weaklings? None of them have Luxnick's blood. Of the two that do, one of them is clearly not trying very hard while the other is eating. Yet, despite not having Luxnick's blood or Viola and Montek's blood for that matter, it only takes 50 of them to overwhelm 9 of us. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. A snort sounded. Don't us me together with them. Those few down there don't even have 0.20 blood density. Why are you lumping me in? Just shut up about yourself for a second. If you want to be so arrogant, why don't you take that attitude to the Luxnick's family estate? Go see how the real geniuses feel about you. The snorter fell into silence, sending a glance over to the man by his side. Anyway, use your head for a second. How is it that a group of youths without a drop of the 3 strongest bloodlines of this sector somehow have the strength to fight back in a 50-on-9 battle against individuals who do have it? Don't you think it's fishy? The rooftop fell into silence. This was indeed a bit surprising. While the numbers looked unfair, it should have been unfair for Earth, not the other way around. He disappeared. No, he's right here. The 3 shifted their gaze to find Lionel's smiling figure looking back at them. At some unknown time, Lionel had gone from eating his fill to standing on the very same roof as them all. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_G experience. Chapter 11:10. Hello. Lionel smiled lightly as though he was meeting some old friends. The 3 youths before him were quite unique. They all had golden hair, though not as pure nor as bright as main branch members. However, what truly distinguished them were their eyes. One had a pair of radiant blue irises, another had very warm brown eyes that seemed only a shade or 2 away from amber, and the last very pale green eyes. These were the hallmarks of the top 3 branch families of the Luxnicks. There was Kian, the Tier 7 genius of the 3rd-ranked Vora branch and his pale green eyes. Vaughn, the Tier 7 genius of the 2nd-ranked Strack branch and his brown near amber eyes. And finally there was Ren, the Tier 7 genius of the 1st-ranked Ruatern branch. Each of these 3 branches controlled an entire galaxy all to their own and had positions that were quite interchangeable. The gap between them were so close that they were functionally seen as a single unit. In fact, there was a large disparity between themselves and the 4th-ranked branch families and beyond. Lionel couldn't help but note that all of these top-line geniuses were Tier 7. The only exception had been Raya, who was Tier 8. That was likely not a coincidence, but Lionel didn't have enough information or data points to draw a conclusion. Of course, if Lionel had known that Richard Viola, who he had met in the Dimensional Cleanse Trial world, was a member of the Viola family, he would have noted that he too had been Tier 7. By then he might have realized that there was more to this than what it seemed. Kian, Vaughn and Ren all looked toward one another before looking back toward Lionel. They had been leisurely watching the battle in one moment, but the instant they lost track of Lionel, he had already appeared here. Was it teleportation? but there was at least a half-kilometer distance between themselves and where Lionel had been. How could someone in the fifth dimension teleport so far in a sixth-dimensional world? Their expressions turned serious. I assume that you came here for a reason? Kian, the most abrasive of the three, was the first to recover, dressing down Lionel with his gaze. Visit. For a better user experience, of course. Lionel said lightly. I just wanted to ask you all not to make things too difficult on me and my people. It would be quite a problem if we also had to fight you all too. The three were stunned. What had this man just said? Did they hear correctly? Kian burst into a fit of laughter, slowly standing up from his reclining chair. His green eyes flashed to a peak of emerald for a moment as he took a step forward. Are you asking us to show mercy? Well, if you want to think of it that way, to accept my proposal, sure. Kian's sneer only deepened when he heard this. This is the first time I've ever heard of a Luxnix being so cowardly. Sure, we can agree not to attack you. Just hand over all your resources and scram first. If you didn't even want to fight, why did you come all the way here? To embarrass your ancestors? Not exactly. Lionel responded quite calmly despite Kian's words. How old are you this year? Kian frowned hearing the line of questioning. However, it wasn't like his age was a secret to begin with. Since Lionel was being so amusing, he thought he would oblige. I'm 102 this year. If you're thinking of using your age as an excuse, I've already been at tier 7 for 13 years already. If I had wanted to, I could have been in the 6th dimension already. Lionel nodded. Well, the oldest of them is only 23. Don't you think you should show some leeway as their senior? Visit. For the best no_vil_undersand experience, the pupils of the three constricted. What they didn't know was that it wasn't exactly accurate to say that they were 23. After all, many of them had only been in the dimensional verse for 4 to 5 years. On the other hand, these branch family geniuses started training when they were toddlers. It simply wasn't the same. After his initial shock, Kian's face settled back down. I don't know if you're trying to bullshit me or not, but do you take me for a fool? Where would you possibly get so many young fifth-dimensional beings from? And even if by some small miracle you weren't lying. So what? You want me to give up my chance at a bright future because you're all so young and innocent? Even if you were a baby in a stroller, if it meant me claiming a spot among them, I'd stab a knife through your chest without hesitation. Lionel fell into silence when he heard these words. His gaze shifted from Kian to the other two. You're right. He finally said. It was a bit stupid of me to ask for such a thing. Lionel's palm flipped over and a 3-meter-long dual-bladed silver spear appeared. Let's fight then. Within the Luxnix family estate, two familiar young men sat, enjoying the lavish lifestyle they had been living over the last several weeks. It had simply been too long since they had a chance to rest like this. Being in that place had always felt like being in a constant hellish storm. Of course, these two young men were the prim and proper Orinik and the lazy, untidy Ganner. It wasn't much of a surprise, then, that one side of the dining table was filled with clean plates and cleanly cut pieces of meat while the other looked as though a tornado had passed through. Visit. For the best experience, however, at that moment, both young men froze in unison, their gazes turning somewhat vacant as though they were listening intently to something. Young sirs? Orinik and Ganner were currently being entertained by the geniuses of the Luxnix family. Though Miguel wasn't present, the only 3 youths of this generation to surpass 0.50 bloodline density were. The one who spoke was the youngest and shortest of them. Unlike most of the Luxnix, he had also cut his bright golden hair short, with much of the sides of his head being completely hairless. He was Siller Luxnix, the preeminent genius of the Luxnix main branch's speed arm. When the two recovered their sharpness, Ganner completely ignored the question and went back to eating, but Orinik smiled lightly and explained. We've received word that the first round of the selection event will begin in a month's time. Siller's gaze brightened. He looked like he was still a child in his early teens, but the truth was that he was well into his 30s already. Jim, the second of the 3 geniuses, spoke. He was none other than Eloquin, the preeminent genius of the Luxnix main branch's wisdom arm. He seemed to carry the sharp eyes and slick tongue one would expect from such a person, and he was the tallest of the 3. It seems that it's about time we invite those of the branch families who passed to the family estate. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 11:11. Lionel's blade flashed, his bronze runes blazing to life as a silver armor covered him from head to toe. The pupils of the 3 constricted. They could tell that this wasn't an armor Lionel summoned, it was rather one that was perfectly integrated with his body. The first possibility was that he had constructed this armor out of exceptionally rare materials that could be fused with organic material. The second possibility was that this was a second lineage factor. Regardless of which the truth was, the objective reality was one thing: Lionel was powerful. Very powerful. As though to agree with their speculation, a strong spatial domain suddenly descended. The three youths felt as though it took twice the effort to move the same distance as it had in the past, forcing their expressions into an even more serious state. There was no doubt in their minds that this was an ability of this armor Lionel had just brought out. "You want to fight now? Fine." Kian's expression settled down, his own force beginning to roll forward in waves. "You must really think that I'm some sort of pushover." Kian's palm flipped over, revealing a glaive almost an entire meter taller than himself. Its polearm was a sleek black and its blade was a striking venomous green. The blade itself was somewhat transparent and even seemed refined of a special sort of glass. However, the instant Kian's snow force erupted forth, it lost all its dullness and began to glow to the point its transparency vanished, leaving behind a blade that was not only almost double the size it had been originally, reaching almost 3 feet in length, but also one that shimmered as though it was made entirely of light. An uncomfortable feeling began to hang in the air. Lionel didn't need to think very much to know that this stickiness on his skin was a poison warning. However, as though he couldn't sense the strangeness at all, he shot forward, his spear drawing an elegant arc in the air. Kian sneered, his own blade swinging downward. But his pupils constricted at the result. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Kian had been certain that his weapon would be beyond Lionel's. He currently had a Tier 7 bronze-grade glaive in his possession and it perfect synergized with his abilities. One would be hard-pressed to find a youth with a better weapon than himself. However, the instant they clashed, Kian realized he couldn't have been more wrong. Lionel's spear was actually of the quasi-silver grade. Kian's approach instantly changed. With a skill rarely seen, the instant their blades clashed, he pulled back, his stance shifting. His movement was so swift that it made it difficult to tell anything had happened, but Lionel himself felt as though he had just swung into a target made of cotton. Kian's glaive continued to glide backward, dispersing the strength of Lionel's blow and sweeping it to his back after a sidestep. His gaze lit with greed, but he reined it under control. Lionel might have wielded a spear, but the mechanics and design of it wasn't far from his own glaive and the length was about the same. He could easily see himself using it. And even if he decided that it wasn't worth his time, he could easily sell it to afford to upgrade his own weapon. Since Lionel had chosen to make an enemy out of him, he didn't mind taking him for all the money he was worth. He is more skilled than anyone I've battled before. The latest _SODIs are on website. This was the thought that Lionel had almost instantaneously. Lionel had never had any formal training in the spear and much of what he knew came from himself and cobbling together the insights of the masters of the spear domain. Compared to Kian, who had clearly been wielding a glaive since he was a child, there was a bit of a gap. At least there was a gap until he activated it. Lionel didn't hesitate, his forehead beginning to pulse with a golden light. Through the visor and helmet of his armor, the shimmering print of a golden spear made itself known. In unison, Lionel pressed forward, wild spear force suddenly erupting around him. In one moment, Kian was effortlessly gliding Lionel's force to a harmless location. In the next, Lionel's spear had flipped in his hands, a second blade cutting toward Kian's neck with a violent momentum. Kian's expression changed. Impossible. Vaughn and Rin no longer remained seated, realizing that this would be a problem instantly. Vaughn and Rin both flipped their palms to reveal two swords. As though by tacit agreement, they pincered Lionel in from both sides. If Lionel dared to continue his strike, he would definitely end up fatally wounded. On one side, Vaughn's swordsmanship was like a rocky avalanche, erratic and alternating between soft mudslides and harsh, rolling boulders. On the other, Ren's swordsmanship was akin to a rippling wave. A single flick of the wrist caused fluid and sudden movements. There was something decidedly beautiful about it all. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersg experience, the differences were both reflected in the size of their sword. Ren's was barely 2 fingers wide while Vaughn's was easily 4. One used a single hand while the other insisted on 2. At that moment, though, the three were suddenly shrouded by an oppressive aura. Fear gripped their hearts and sweat coated their palms, nearly causing their weapons to slip from their hands. Duality. The flickering image of a small man barely 3 inches tall appeared above Lionel's head. The instant it did, Lionel's domain seemed to become like unshakable laws of the world, so ingrained into reality that they became as fundamental as gravity itself. All the strength that Qian, Vaughn and Ren had mustered in that moment was suddenly sapped away, flooding Lionel's own body and filling him with a raging power. Qian's gaze flickered with despair as Lionel's blade reached his neck, drawing blood. The crimson droplets sprinkled to the floor, leaving the hotel roof beneath in eerie silence. More coming. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 11-12. Lionel's blade just barely nicked Qian's skin, the cold glint in his eyes obvious beneath his visor. The three youths were shaken. Even though Qian was the only one with a blade to his neck, Vaughn and Ren, who were practically trapped in space, were just as fear-filled. Vaughn and Ren had never stopped piercing their swords forward. It was just that so much of their strength has been sapped by Lionel's duality domain that what once was twice the effort to move the same distance had become over a dozen times the effort. If one didn't look closely, it would seem as though they had been frozen in time. The three had been able to pretty much ignore Lionel's spatial domain by diverting their force to counteract it. But when it was paired with this second domain, it felt as though they were small fish swimming against the ocean's tides. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. He used natural spear force, natural spear force, enlightened spear force. These were Lionel's so-called level 1, level 2 and level 3 weapon forces. He might not know their true names due to purposely keeping himself ignorant, but this didn't mean that the same could be said for others. Visit for a better user experience. The moment Lionel's natural spear force erupted, Vaughn and Ren knew that they had still underestimated Lionel. To put these matters into perspective, even in the top 3 branch families of the Luxniks, not a single soul of the younger generation had awakened to their natural weapon force. In fact, each of them could count on a single hand the number of 6th-dimensional old monsters who had accomplished this in their families. However, even with that being the case, none of the three of them could take their eyes off of the 3-inch being sitting above Lionel's head. They felt as though their souls were being sucked out of their bodies every time they laid eyes on it, their knees threatening to collapse beneath them. It felt like that small little being was the antithesis of all that was life. It embodied pure death and destruction, as though it wouldn't stop until everything was eradicated. Just looking toward it made them all feel a piercing pain in their heads. Lionel slowly retracted his spear and pierced one end into the ground. I think the result is pretty obvious now and we don't need to continue, correct? Lionel swept a gaze over the three of them. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Qian, Vaughn and Ren all remained silent, their jaws clenched. By now Vaughn and Ren had lowered their swords. They realized that there wasn't much of a point in continuing. Even if this technique took a lot out of Lionel, something that was very clearly not immediately obvious, it was still more than enough time for him to take them out. Even after several moments of thought, none of them could think of a counter. In all likelihood, even if there was some sort of counter to this, they simply weren't privy to it. Of course, this small figure was the manifestation of Lionel's. Rather than taking the form of something else, it took the form of himself and gave his king's might a tangible representation. In truth, even Lionel hadn't expected his king's might's artistic conception to be so powerful. But he was well aware that this was only one part due to his king's might itself, but at least 2 to 3 parts due to the artistic conception he had chosen. Lionel couldn't help but take another subconscious glance toward his right hip. He felt that even now, he hadn't quite understood just what was in his body and what it represented. Just as Lionel was about to nod and leave, not particularly needing the response of the three of them, a sudden surge of force caught his attention. Lionel's brow furrowed as his head snapped in a certain direction. From this vantage point, he could just barely catch a glimpse of a corner of the long pathway leading up to the 10 hotels. Near the front, there was a large community square laid of stone. Under normal circumstances, such a location would be used for the in and out traffic of vehicles. But, with this being the private property of the Luxniks, it wasn't truly used in this way. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. In that moment, a platform rose up and the large fountain that had taken up the center of the square became a teleportation pad upon which several individuals appeared. Lionel's gaze immediately narrowed. He couldn't see the others because his own hotel blocked the view of them from this viewpoint, but the one he could see left Lionel feeling a tangible pressure. Lionel had no reference for how powerful those of the main branch were, so he had subconsciously believed that the gap between them and the like of Qian, Vaughn and Ren couldn't be too far apart. But it only took this single experience for him to understand just how wrong he was. The gap was enormous. In fact, it was akin to night and day. The two groups might as well have been completely alien to one another. Is that so? Right then the sound of a sonorous bell resounded. The battle between Lionel's brothers and the people of Earth against those of the 5th, 7th and 8th branch families came to a halt. Though, unfortunately for the latter group, their sudden stop resulted in many of them getting sucker punched. But who could blame the youths of Earth? After all, they didn't understand the significance of that sound. Whatever rage the branch family youths had about this though could only be quickly doused in water. This is an edict of the Luxniks. All those with bloodline densities of 0, 10 and higher are to report here within the next 10 minutes. Failure to do so will result in 10 lashes and excommunication from the family. Visit. For the best no_vel_it_g experience. Chapter 11:13. Lionel's brow raised when he made eye contact with Noah. There was something particularly shifty about Noah's gaze at the moment, as though he wanted to say something or was regretting something, but he also seemed to realize that it was too late to do so. The both of them had been making their way to the front of the hotel after hearing the announcement when they crossed paths. It was immediately obvious to Lionel that Noah was holding back something. It makes sense. Noah probably knows more about the Luxniks than I do, but he isn't a very talkative person to begin with, so he probably didn't know how to start the conversation. Lionel smiled and shook his head. He couldn't decide whether this cousin of his was a block of wood or an adorable teddy bear. Either way, whatever it was, Lionel didn't think it would change much. The fact that those presents had been left for him gave him a clue to something. At the very least, he didn't think that his life would be in danger. He would just greet what came with a smile until it warranted a frown. As for what happened from here on out, there was no point in worrying about it as he couldn't change it anyway. Lionel patted Noah's shoulder. Don't worry about it. Noah's brows arched up. For some reason he felt better after Lionel said this. But he still smiled bitterly on the outside. Lionel could only be so carefree because he didn't have any idea what would likely happen over there. Noah didn't know the full story of what happened back then and had only ever learned some snippets, but he knew enough to know that this was a sticky situation. But, much like Lionel, after seeing the gifts left on his bed, he had a bit of confidence that at least their lives wouldn't be in danger. That was why he chose to come anyway. Oh? The latest _IP_SODIes are on _the website. Noah's gaze turned back to find Kian, Vaughn and Ren. It wasn't only him who noticed this, but the youths of the Mueter, Unia and Cuvan branches did so as well. Seeing the pale state of their faces, many of them were confused, but Noah gave a deep look toward Lionel, who just grinned back. Noah shook his head and didn't say much of anything. It seemed that Lionel had benefited from those gifts far more than he had. The group of youths suddenly froze in place, their eyelashes trembling as their breathing became shallow. The few of them had rounded the final corner to finally lay eyes on the group that had come from the Luxniks. But, the instant they did, it felt as though all the oxygen in the surroundings had been sucked away. There were only 3 individuals present. Each of them wore white leather armor, beautifully tailored and perfectly fitted. It followed the curves of the 2 women to perfection and outlined the broad shoulder and chest of the man immaculately. Each had a 12-point star on their lapels and gorgeously embroidered and delicately detailed golden feathers on their tall collars. This was a uniform recognized throughout the whole of the sector, a sign of one of the mightiest and strongest fighting forces of the Luxniks, the Feather Sword Warriors. Ah, such cool uniforms. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's words almost made Noah fall over. Whatever heavy momentum the Feather Sword Warriors had faltered as they all looked toward who spoke through the silence with incredulous expressions. The 3 Feather Sword Warriors had no idea how to respond to this. Technically, Lionel had complimented them, so there was nothing to fault him for. However, couldn't he read the atmosphere? And wasn't he supposed to be awed into silence? This wasn't part of the script at all. The male Feather Sword Warrior cleared his throat as the 2 women covered their lips. Line up, he said coldly. The branch family youths didn't dare to be as nonchalant as Lionel. In the end, they all formed a line facing the 3 Feather Sword Warriors. Though there were thousands in the hotels, most of them were subordinates that didn't meet the 0-10 threshold and relied on the geniuses of their branches for a spot. So, in the end, there were only just over 20 who appeared. In the distance, many peeked in on what was happening, but the Feather Sword Warriors didn't seem to care as the male began to speak. Today I will be taking you to the Luxniks family estate. The moment he said these words, a sudden bubbling of excitement took hold. But when he raised his hand to stop it, silence fell once more just as quickly. My task today isn't just to escort you, but it's to also act as a reminder. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersng experience, in 1 month's time, the recruitment of the Void Palace will begin. The excited murmurings returned, but this time they hushed on their own. Many gripped their fists, their eyes lighting up with their hopes and dreams. You all seem very excited by this prospect, but it's clear that this is only because you have no idea what sort of weight the Void Palace name has. There is nothing to be excited about. The Void Palace is a place where those far more talented, far stronger and far more valiant than you all go to die. The heaviness of the atmosphere amplified, many beginning to choke on their own attempted air intake. The Void Palace is the line of defense that protects the human domain from those who seek to cause us harm. Being chosen by them means a lifetime of glory, but it also represents a lifetime of responsibility. Today the Luxnix family will give you a chance to prove yourself and gain their nurturing for the coming month, but what you receive will still depend on your ability. Your bloodline gets you this far and the rest will be up to you. Step forward. The group of youths did as they were told and the teleportation platform began to flicker. When the lights faded, they too had vanished. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 11:14. When Lionel's vision cleared, he was greeted by grand golden gates. Unlike the day when the envoys of the Void Palace arrived, they were firmly shut this time around. Familiar motes of light still hung about the skies, illuminating even the day with both a delicate light and a refreshing fragrance. Standing here made even mundane air taste better than usual, the intoxicating feeling filling your lungs to the brink. Lionel's hands slipped into his pockets, his expression hard to read. It was already normally difficult to tell what was going through his head, but at the moment it seemed to be even more so than usual. The 3 feather sword warriors stood at the helm waiting beneath the tall gates. The guards on either side of the it stood at attention, their faces obscured by their golden armor and their bodies as rigid as statues. Lionel found this situation to be a bit odd. Since the Luxnix should have known they were coming, why was it that the gates were closed? Lionel swept another glance over the surroundings, leisurely taking it all in before his gaze once more landed on the feather sword warriors. They still stood beneath the gates without movement, but they seemed to be silently communicating with one another. It didn't take a genius to guess that they were confused about what was going on as well. This policy seemed to have changed. The male feather sword warrior spoke. Ever since that attack, security has been a bit tighter. You know that it's not that simple. It was Lady Fluttering Star Order who commanded us to do this. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersng experience, the 3 fell into silence after they heard these words. Fluttering Star Order was part of the wisdom arm of the main family, but her identity was a bit more sensitive than this. She had also been experiencing the suppression of her other family members for a long while now, and it only seemed to have increased after the envoys of the Void Palace returned. The 3 feather sword warriors had expected to face some resistance, but they weren't in position to ignore the orders of a Star Order elder, especially since they were only 0-point feather sword warriors. They didn't have as much leeway as their 4, 8 and 12-point superiors. To many they were only considered to be trainees. Knowing the sensitivity of the issue, though they could do so, the 3 feather star warriors didn't dare to command the guards to open the gates. Though their status was low, that was only relative to the true big shots. Anyone who could become a feather star warrior was an elite among the main family's geniuses. Mere gate guards couldn't ignore their orders at all. However, whether one could do versus whether one should do something were 2 completely different matters entirely. To reach their position, these 3 didn't only have to have combat talent, but they were also very intelligent. They knew how to toe the political line. Fluttering Star Order had informed them to bring the branch family members to the estate, and they had done so. They had even gone out of their way to speak flowery words and made these kids feel like they truly had a chance to snatch greatness. They had done enough. If the gates were shut here, Fluttering Star Order couldn't blame them. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersng experience, Lionel continued to silently observe this awkward atmosphere as the minutes began to tick by. However, on the inside his displeasure was already growing. He could make a guess at what was going on. Clearly not everyone in the Luxnix family were willing to welcome them with open arms, and these feather sword warriors were caught in the middle of this strife. However, this didn't stop Lionel from disliking the situation in the slightest. Yip. Little Black Star, who had found his way back to Lionel's head, patted his forehead with a small paw. At least the little guy had a conscience. Lionel had almost assumed that he would choose letting those girls play with him over following him. The little mink actually seemed to be warning Lionel about his temper, something that made Lionel himself chuckle lightly. Which of them was the older one now? You would think that little black star would have come back more bestial after absorbing all that void beast blood, but he was actually like this now. Alright, I know. They're a big six-dimensional family, I won't cause trouble. Little black star's paw patting Lionel's forehead again, but the look in the little guy's eye made it obvious that he didn't believe Lionel's words even for one moment. Lionel smiled and shook his head. Maybe I should just leave. How long do they expect to have me wait at this gate? The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel hadn't come for the Luxniks to begin with. He had only come here because his grandfather had told him his mother was waiting for him. It was only after coming to this place that he learned about all of this Void Palace nonsense and realized that this situation might be more complex than he thought. Unfortunately, his mother was nowhere to be seen and he had no idea how to find her. In fact, it even seemed from those gifts that she didn't want to be found for whatever reason. In that case, why was he wasting his time here then? Having lost his patience, Lionel looked over to Noah. He planned on explaining his thoughts and then Noah could decide for himself whether to stay or not. However, just when he was going to do so, something caught his attention. On the road on the opposite side of the closed golden gates, a white-robed old woman was walking her way forward. Though her gait seemed slow, her every step took her tens of meters. In just a few blinks, she had made it to the gate with a light smile on her face. Open the gates. She spoke lightly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Yes. The gate guards didn't dare to hesitate. This was a Star Order elder before them, the now infamous Fluttering Star Order. Visit. For a better user experience. More coming, smiley face. August 4th, 22. Chapter 11:15. Fluttering Star Order waited patiently as the large golden gates opened. Despite their size, the maintenance performed on them was impeccable. They swung open without the slightest noise. Even the wind itself seemed to still as they moved. The instant the gates opened, the three Feather Sword warriors dropped to a single knee. We greet. Fluttering Star Order waved a hand and the Feather Sword warriors shot to their feet before they could realize what was happening. There's no need for so much formality. I'll have to thank you three for bringing over these children to me, I appreciate it. The Feather Sword warriors opened their mouths to say something, but in the end they closed them once more and sighed. The fact that Fluttering Star Order didn't allow them to pay respects to her seemed like an act of humility on the surface, but in practice it was her drawing a clean line between the two of them. On the one hand, this would protect them from the rage of the other Star Order elders. However, it would also mean that whatever relationship they had had with Fluttering Star Order would end from this day forth. Visit. For a better user experience, the Feather Sword warriors couldn't help but feel complicated at this point. Fluttering Star Order had always been kind to them, but now that she was in need, they had essentially turned their back on her. However, what else could they do? They were just small rowing boats amidst a storm of black waters. Even if they braced themselves for the storm and helped Fluttering Star Order out to the best of their abilities, they would only sink along with her. It was better to have no backing at all than backing that would guarantee your death. Bowing apologetically once more, the three rushed into the estate, quickly vanishing. All the while, Fluttering Star Order hadn't spared them another glance. With a kind smile, her focus had been turned to the Branch family youths. Lionel's gaze narrowed somewhat. He could sense the tension and could feel that this interaction entailed more than their simple words and actions would make it seem. It's clear that their actions made this elder somewhat unhappy. For them to dare to do such a thing, it seems that the situation of the elder isn't very good. That doesn't bode well for the rest of us, it seems. Hello, I am Fluttering Star Order, you may call me Elder Fluttering for short. I've heard that the Branch families have produced quite some talents in these recent years, it seems that this wasn't incorrect. Fluttering Star Order swept a gaze over them all, but her words felt a bit empty. It was unlikely that an elder of her status would know much about them. Usually, the Branch families would be lucky if even a Feather Sword warrior came to visit their families, let alone a Star Order elder. Visit. For the best experience when the Feather Sword warriors had come to pick them up, it had already been greatly surprising to a few. But, the sharpest among them could tell that this wasn't exactly something they could be happy about right now. In all likelihood, they had just unwittingly become chess pieces in a game of political struggle. And, to make matters worse, since this elder Fluttering had to stoop so low as to use them of all people, it was clear that her back was against the wall and she didn't have many other options. Unfortunately, they had even less options than the Feather Sword warriors did. Even if some of them knew, they could only allow themselves to be used. Lionel suddenly felt the distinct lack of Raya. He wondered if she knew that this storm was coming and chose not to participate on purpose. But this was fine too. Unlike the others, he and Noah weren't very afraid of what might happen. In that case, they might as well go with the flow. Fluttering Star Order's expression didn't change from her cheery smile. Good, good. Come with me. Fluttering Star Order turned and walked into the estate. Without a choice, the youths could only follow to her back, many of them wearing heavy expressions. However, Lionel's smile had returned as he strolled forward. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. This will be interesting. The Luxnix family estate is quite large and covers about 100,000 kilometers squared. You can find everything you could ever want or need here without much issue, but there are also many restricted areas you have to be mindful of. Rather than listing them out, though, it will be much easier if I point out to you all the areas you can enter. Like this, a mighty Star Order elder suddenly became the tour guide of 20-odd youths, walking through the family estate while attracting the weird glances and looks of several passers-by. Luckily, none of them dared to question the actions of a Star Order elder. As such, the group traveled deeper and deeper into the Luxnix family estate, eventually reaching a particular section of guest rooms Elder Fluttering had likely prepped for them. However, there was only so long a cover of paper could hide a smoldering fire. Fluttering Star Order. You've grown bold. The voice was a cross of shrill, crass and hoarse. If Lionel didn't know better, he would have thought that this old woman's vocal cords was forged of a fork and a steel plate. If it wasn't for Lionel's mental fortitude, his spine would have shivered beside itself. The old woman wore a white robe not much unlike Fluttering Star Order, and she had the lingering marks of a beauty in her old age as well, something both shared. However, this woman's face was far more twisted and there was the mark of a flickering flame on her forehead. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Had Lionel been there the day the Void Palace envoys arrived, he would have recognized this woman as Sparking Star Order. It seemed that the Star Order elders were still at a head. Even now, the matter only seemed to have grown worse. Chapter 11:16. The furious aura swept out like a torrent. In that instant, several of the Branch family youths shivered and fell, their faces paling with fear. How could they possibly match up to the momentum of a sixth-dimensional expert? Even someone who had just stepped into the sixth dimension would be enough to shake them to their core, let alone Sparking Star Order, who was just a few steps from the seventh dimension. Fluttering Star Order frowned, releasing her own momentum to counter Elder Sparking. One side was like a raging wildfire and the other was a delicate breeze. They met in the middle and clashed, shooting up and dispersing into the air. However, the result was enough to send hurricane-force winds spiraling into the surroundings. The leaves of several tall trees and the well-kept grass pastures fluttered wildly, much of the greenery nearly being ripped from their branches to fall to their deaths. Fluttering Star Order turned back first to see if the youths were all right. She hadn't thought that Sparking Star Order would be shameless enough to directly target them from the very beginning, so her guard hadn't quite been up. She had been ready for a war of words, but it seemed that she had underestimated the vicious nature of her opponent. Several of the youths lay on the ground coughing up blood. But, Fluttering Star Order's pupils constricted when she realized that there were two youths who were standing amidst the wild winds as though nothing had happened. Toward this result, even Sparking Star Order frowned lightly, not having expected this either. Of course, these Star Order elders didn't know that Noah and Lionel were fairly immune to such coercive attacks, at least within a certain threshold. Now that Lionel had a better understanding of emperors and kings' might, he too understood this as well. Because of this lineage factor, their focus states had always innately placed pressure on others, and it also gave them a boost to their mental defenses. The lineage factor born of Earth's Fox family was clearly not simple. You have a lot of nerve targeting my guests like this, Sparking Star Order. Visit. For the best no_vil_undershinji experience, Fluttering Star Order quickly regained her bearings, her gaze sharpening. Her expression wasn't as ferocious as Sparking Star Order's had been, but the solemnity in her tone was more than enough to bring her point across. Elder Sparking snapped out of her stupor, her shock settling into a sneer. Your guests? Do you take me for a fool? You're wasting valuable family resources on trash. Valuable resources? Never mind the fact that I have yet to give them anything. How valuable are treasures of the fifth dimension? You really have the face to say you worry about the scarcity of something the family has so much of? Sparking Star Order's expression darkened. In the past, Fluttering Star Order had never been so combative. When the envoys arrives, Sparking Star Order and the others realized that Elder Fluttering's words were a bit more biting than they usually were as well. They had already decided that after the selection of the Void Palace was over, that they would find a method to expel her from the Star Order. However, it seemed that what they had forgotten to consider was the fact that maybe Fluttering Star Order was being so abrasive precisely because she was prepared to counterattack in the first place. It was only after seeing how sharp Fluttering Star Order's reply was that this finally sunk in for Sparking Star Order. But what gave Fluttering Star Order so much confidence? She was facing up against almost the whole of the Star Order Council. Even if the neutral parties were ignored, that still left about 60% of the council, while Fluttering Star Order was practically all alone. Sparking Star Order's gaze narrowed further. She wasn't a fool, nor did she believe that Fluttering Star Order was a fool either. Right at that moment, the door to the building behind Sparking Star Order opened to reveal the head of a beautiful young woman with a strong jaw. Her red gold hair was especially striking beneath the shimmering sunlight as her eyes blinked innocently. Visit. For a better user experience, Sparking Star Order looked back for a moment, the gears of her mind churning. Raya? Lionel's brows arched, his own expression remaining placid, but the smile on his face curling all the more. He suddenly felt like this matter was only getting more interesting. What are you doing, Raya? Properly greet your elders. Ah yes, right, grandmother. Raya pretended to have forgotten basic etiquette as she scrambled to Sparking Star Order's front, bowing respectfully. Greetings, Elder Sparking. Sparking Star Order snorted, hardly acknowledging the greeting as her gaze shifted back to Fluttering Star Order. You believe that you can turn the tables by relying on the Void Palace? You are truly too naive. Do you think that just anyone can gain a place? Oh. Fluttering Star Order chuckled. Now you want to give the Void Palace its due respect? Just a few weeks ago, it was this very Elder Sparking who had raged about the Void Palace sending 2 galaxy-rank students to them. Now she wanted to paint a grandiose picture of the Void Palace? How two-faced. Sparking Star Order didn't react much to this taunt. Much of her over-the-top temper was nothing more than a facade. The reality was that she was very good at controlling her emotions. It was just that sometimes the impact of a Karen was far better than a docile elder. This image also allowed her to step outside the bounds of the rules from time to time to get things done her way faster. After all, an emotional elder, especially an elder woman, gained a lot of leeway from many people by default. How could she not take advantage? Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, regardless of how I feel about the Void Palace, the fact you want to rely on branch family trash to dig yourself out of a hole of your own creation speaks for itself. Fluttering Star Order inwardly sneered. Obviously these branch family members are just a cover so that she could rightfully bring her granddaughter in to enjoy the resources of the Luxniks. Sparking Star Order definitely knew this as well, but that wouldn't stop her from taking multiple digs. In addition, Sparking Star Order continued unperturbed. What use is it? Will any of them rank higher than Miguel? By that point, won't all these petty games you're playing be meaningless? This time, Fluttering Star Order couldn't hold back her smile in the slightest. Miguel? What does he have to do with you? In fact, if I recall correctly, Miguel no longer has any close blood-related relatives remaining. What right do you have to claim any piece of his success? However, Fluttering Star Order's voice suddenly became so low that only someone as powerful as Sparking Star Order could possibly pick up on it. I have an outstanding granddaughter and my grandson not only has 0.50 blood density while in the 5th dimension, but he is also the head of the Wisdom Arm's younger generation. What do you have? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Sparking Star Order's body went rigid before she saw red. Her lack of descendants was her biggest reverse scale. Feeling it being pierced through with such venom filled her with such rage that she was about to erupt. Chapter 11:17. Author's note: Fluttering Star Order is not Lionel's grandmother. She is simply someone who sided with Lionel's grandmother at the time and received backlash for it. Now she's trying to carve out a path for herself. Fluttering Star Order no longer held back with her words. She knew well what kind of scar this was for Sparking Star Order, especially considering how she had lost her descendants to begin with, but Fluttering Star Order no longer cared about these matters of decorum. Considering how far these matters had gone, even if she wouldn't lay all her cards face up just yet, she wasn't far from doing so either. Sparking Star Order's rage suddenly became a dark laughter. The smoldering heat of her fury simmered almost tangibly. For a moment she truly almost lost control of herself. After she began to use this facade of a short-tempered woman, it had ironically been a very long time since anyone had blatantly provoked her in this way, so she was unused to it. It seemed that her acting skills had gotten just a bit too good. Good. Sparking Star Order nodded. "I'll take your words under advisement." Sparking Star Order lightly tapped her bulbous walking stick, her body vanishing in a flutter of butterflies formed of flames. Before they knew it, she was gone. Raya, who had just been politely bowing to Sparking Star Order, straightened out her body and looked toward her grandmother. She never knew that her grandmother had such a sharp mouth, but this only made her feel even more guilty than usual. For a usually mild-tempered woman like her grandmother to act like this now, it could be imagined how much hardship she had experienced in these past several years. Raya gripped her fists tightly. She had to claim a spot in the Void Palace for her grandmother. Only in that way could she wash away the years of humiliation she had suffered. Visit. For a better user experience, Fluttering Star Order patted her granddaughter's head with a doting expression before turning back to the rest. "For the next month you all can stay here. As I've said before, there are many areas you cannot cross into. If you die at the hands of someone you offend, there will be nothing I can do for you. For the duration of these matters, you'll be under the leadership of my granddaughter." Her expression turned far more serious as she continued. "So long as you can follow instruction and work hard, there will be benefits. If not..." Fluttering Star Order didn't finish her words, but the branch family youths, many of whom were still on the ground wheezing from the earlier confrontation, felt that this woman might very well be far less amiable and caring than they had originally thought. Raya swept a gaze over the youths and shook her head. It landed on Lionel and Noah before her brows scrunched up. She remembered Lionel and Noah, and even remembered how they had met. But, for some reason, she felt fuzzy on some things. She shook her head and everything seemed to go back to normal. They performed better than the others. I think their bloodline density was above 0.20. That must be why I have a good impression of them. Raya thought to herself before sighing once again. Grandmother might be being a bit too harsh with this approach. Raya shook her head once more and threw such thoughts away. Visit. For a better user experience, I'll leave these matters to you, little Raya. With that, Fluttering Star Order vanished as well, a gentle brush of wind being left in her wake. Lionel stared at where the elder had disappeared, his expression fused with a mixture of amusement and coldness. He didn't need to understand the full story to know that even if Fluttering Star Order wasn't so bold as to call them trash like Sparking Star Order had, she didn't think of them very much differently at all. There was no doubt in Lionel's mind that their role here was likely to act as cannon fodder for Fluttering Star Order's granddaughter and her grandson as well. As for what they were needed as fodder for, it was likely to be the Void Palace's selection. Lionel wasn't entirely sure how it worked, so he could only guess this to be the case. But he didn't believe that he was very far off either. So this is the Luxnix family, huh? Lionel's expression gradually lost much of its amusement to be left with nothing but indifference. Now that things had come this far, Lionel knew he couldn't leave. Never mind whether or not Fluttering Star Order would allow that, but considering how frequently that woman had mentioned how they weren't allowed to roam about the estate randomly, even mentioning how they might be killed, it was clear that this was a not-so-silent hint at just how caged they were. Visit. For a better user experience, Fluttering Star Order's stance couldn't have been more obvious. She hadn't gotten their names, didn't ask about their abilities, and she hadn't even double-checked if they really had 0.10 bloodline density or not. It was as though it simply didn't matter to her. Lionel crossed his arm over his chest, entering a state of absolute calm. Raya suddenly snapped out of her own thoughts. Right, I will see if I can call someone over from the healing arm to help you all out. I will be right back. In the meantime, feel free to choose your rooms if you can move. The door that's closed and locked is mine, but you can choose from any of the other ones. Raya rushed away after saying these words. Clearly, the previous restrictions Fluttering Star Order had mentioned didn't apply to her in the slightest. But this much was to be expected. After all, if the grandchild of a Star Order elder couldn't move around freely, then who could? Of course, Lionel had no idea just how ironic this thought of his was. Without moving, Lionel turned his gaze over to Noah. The both of them made eye contact and the displeasure hidden deep within their irises didn't escape the other. I feel like you had something to tell me before, right? Lionel asked. The latest _IP_SODIes are on the website. Chapter 11:18. Lionel and Noah entered the building. It was quite the luxurious place, even several levels above the hotel the two had just been in. Lionel could feel that there was a gathering force art embedded into the building itself, making him feel as though he gained twice the results with half the effort in this place. The pair eventually realized that the so-called locked door Raya referred to was the entire top floor. It would have been a bit naive of them to believe after what happened before that their accommodations would be exactly the same, but after seeing the truth of it all, they couldn't help but laugh coldly. The two ended up in the dining room. There wasn't a large spread of food, but there were some small servings of fruit and snacks. Lionel had never gotten the chance to finish eating, so he just took what he could get. Noah sat across from him, seemingly hesitating on how to start. But in the end he just shook his head. I don't know the full details of the story. All I know is what I've managed to pick up from the conversations of Imperial Grandfather and Father. They also don't seem to like to talk about it often. Or more accurately, Imperial Grandfather can't be bothered. Whenever Imperial Grandfather is finished with a topic, it's too difficult to get him to open back up again. Visit. For a better user experience to start, the relationship between Imperial Grandfather and Grandmother is quite estranged. Though Imperial Grandfather has never said that they are divorced, it's functionally no different. I have never met Imperial Grandmother, but from my understanding she is likely somewhere in the Luxnix estate, secluded from others. I'm not sure if she would even be aware of our arrival or not. As for what separated our Imperial grandparents, I wasn't sure at first, but the matter is likely related to you. Sometime in the past, not long after you were born, you were entrusted to Imperial Grandmother. Your birth was very hard on Imperial Aunt from my understanding, and she very nearly died. This caught many off guard because it wasn't something even the healing arm of the Luxnix predicted. Mothers sometimes face trouble during childbirth when the father comes from a far higher dimensional world, but it was thought that Imperial Aunt wouldn't have this issue due to her talent. Not only was Imperial Aunt already at the 6th dimension at the time, but she was also the wielder of Earth's world spirit. The amount of life energy and vitality she had should have dwarfed most women even of 7th dimensional worlds. Regardless of what reasons there might have been, Imperial Aunt's condition was a matter of life and death after your birth. Imperial Grandfather couldn't do anything from Earth, and Imperial Aunt had wanted to give birth by Imperial Grandmother's side, so she chose to do so in the Luxnix estate. The result was Imperial Aunt's life hanging by a thread and your father having no choice but to take her away. I have no idea where your father took Imperial Aunt to be treated, but I do know that she came back healthy and feeling better than she ever had. The trouble, though, came in what happened while they were gone. Visit. For a better user experience, though I'm not certain of where your father took Imperial Aunt, it must have been either a very dangerous location or at least one greatly inconvenient to take a child. As a result, you were left with Imperial Grandmother. This is the point in the story where I have the largest gaps. I only have certain speculations. Something was done to you in the absence of your father and Imperial Aunt. Imperial Grandmother likely trusted the wrong people. Back then, Imperial Grandmother's status in the Luxnix family was very high, maybe only short of 1 or 2 people, if that. Due to that, she carried the weight of many duties. Your father and Imperial Aunt were gone for far longer than anyone expected. As such, things reached a point where there were certain duties that Imperial Grandmother couldn't continue to put off. As such, you were put into the care of people Imperial Grandmother thought she could trust, and the result was something being taken from you. As for what that something was, I also have no idea. Noah gazed into Lionel's eyes, but all he saw was a vast abyss looking back at him. From the start of the story to this point, Lionel hadn't spoken a single word, nor did he interrupt or show any sort of reaction. The latest _IP_SODIes are on the website. However, Noah could feel it. That abyss in his eyes only seemed to be getting deeper. The fact Lionel had long since stopped eating spoke volumes. This middle portion of the story is too muddled for me to give you any great details. What I do know is that whatever was taken from you also placed you on the brink of life and death. You had gone from a very healthy baby boy, likely a size too big for a child your age, to practically a shriveled-up corpse. Had Imperial Grandmother not found you in time, it was very likely that you would have died. I'm not sure where in this timeline your father and Imperial Aunt came back, but it was decided that the only way to save you was to bring you back to Earth. As for why that is, I'm not sure either. Unfortunately, Imperial Aunt had already become a student of the Void Palace. Under normal circumstances, she should have been executed for getting pregnant while having this duty in the first place. But the Void Palace, for whatever reason, looked the other way. Having already bent their rules once, they couldn't allow Imperial Aunt to bend them again to remain by your side, so she was forced to return. Lionel's expression didn't fluctuate in the slightest, however his mind was a different story. When he first awakened his dream force, all of his memories had returned like a flood. And yet, he had only remembered his mother's face, but he didn't remember his grandfather or grandmother. Why was that? The latest _IP_SODs are on _the website. You actually brought us here to tend to branch family trash. Do you think my time is so worthless? A sudden sharp voice carried in from the outside to reach the ears of the pair of cousins. Lionel gently placed a half-eaten fruit down on the plate before him and walked out with slow and deliberate steps. Chapter 11:19. Noah raised a hand to say something, but in the end he just sighed. Forget it. Imperial Aunt is probably somewhere, right? If not, Imperial Grandmother definitely is. Maybe if he makes a large enough commotion it'll alert her before we die. Noah rose up and followed after Lionel. Lionel stepped out the building to find a fuming Raya and a group of 3 youths, each of whom wore expressions that were a cross of unhappy and sneering. Raya's height was shorter than theirs and it really seemed as though they were towering over her. Lionel swept a glance over the situation before stepping past them toward the branch family youths. After hearing that Raya was going to get help, Lionel had decided to leave them be. After all, he was in an odd situation and wasn't exactly sure whether he should be showing off his talents or not. The attitude of fluttering Star Order was difficult to read. However, Lionel couldn't be bothered to care right now. Why can't you just do as I've asked? They might be branch talents but they still have Luxnick's blood. What would outsiders think if you just let them die? They still have Luxnick's blood? Don't make me laugh. How could 0.10 density garbage possibly be considered to have Luxnick's blood? I could piss out a stream with higher density than that. Raya was immediately furious. He knew that if it was another tier 8 talent on her level, or even if it was her cousin, they wouldn't dare to say these things. Even if her cousin asked them to treat a homeless man by the roadside they would do so without hesitation. It was only because she was she that things had devolved to this level. They still had to give her respect due to who her grandmother was, but they didn't have to go overboard and bend their backs over either. The fact they had come here was enough and no one could criticize their action already. In fact, even if they had rejected her, nothing would happen. Seeing the silence of Raya, the leading youth, a young man by the name of Alphen, sneered. His expression faltered a bit when he noticed Lionel. The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. After a bit he sneered. You're even stowing away more trash in your personal courtyard. To think that you'd waste the family lands like this. Alphen was already unsatisfied himself because he had yet to earn such a place. He could only stay with his branch of the main family or in the collective housing of the healing arm. Only those of the 6th dimension or 5th dimensional talents with great contributions could have a courtyard of their own. It was no wonder he was jealous. Lionel didn't even seem to hear Alphen, something that greatly displeased him. Though the branch youths on the ground tried to hide it, Alphen could sense their trembling rage toward his words. And yet, Lionel had treated him like he was heir. As though that wasn't bad enough, a second young man came out not long after and swept a gaze by him. However, Noah too didn't react much to the words of Alphen. Lionel stopped before the youths and looked them over one by one. After a while he made a decision. Snowy Grace. Lionel reached out a hand and his snow force erupted. The pressure was so great that Raya's pupils constricted and Alphen along with the 2 that came with him took a step back. At that moment, delicate snowflakes began to fall upon the 20 or so youths, mimicking the falling feathers of Lionel's healing branch talent. Compared to Lionel's self-created mage art, this technique was leaps and bounds more potent. With just a bit of effort, more than 20 geniuses who each had strength near and at tier 7 felt as though they had been given a new lease on life. That's... Alphen's brow furrowed as he watched Lionel help Vaughn up. Visit. For the best no _undersing experience, thank you. Vaughn said, feeling a bit complicated. Lionel shook his head. It was a small effort. You. Alphen's voice cut through what remained of the thank yous the branch family youths wanted to speak. How do you know a core technique of our main family? Alphen's tone carried a hint of danger to it. If before he had just been here to poke some fun and throw out some insults, he was now deadly serious. The technique that Lionel had just used was one of the very best of the healing branch. Just to exchange for it took many decades of storing up merit points. Alphen himself was still 2 or 3 years away from being able to afford it, and he had only ever seen seniors much older than him or youths far more talented than himself cast it. Alphen. Raya finally snapped. Do you think you can just treat my people however you want? If you wanted to come up with a lie, shouldn't it be far better than that? How could he possibly know such a technique? Alphen's expression darkened. Piss off, you know nothing. He continued to glower at Lionel's back. That technique was Snowy Grace. It's easily ranked top 3 among fifth-dimensional healing techniques and is known for its area of effectability. If I don't hear a proper explanation today, don't blame me for ignoring who your grandmother is. Raya's face warped. She realized then that if Alphen was willing to bring up her grandmother, he definitely wouldn't be making up nonsense. Her gaze couldn't help but turn toward Lionel. Just what was going on? Who would have expected, though, for Lionel to completely ignore Alphen entirely? He turned back, walking toward Raya's courtyard. It seemed for a moment that he was coming up to them, but it was exactly because of this that it was so shocking when he simply walked right by, not sparing Alphen a single glance. Visit. For a better user experience, Alphen was so infuriated that he began to laugh. Trash of the branch families actually dared to treat him like this? Before Raya could awaken from her shock, Alphen had already moved. The wind crackled and popped as his fist aimed for Lionel's back. He didn't reserve himself in the slightest. In fact, he had struck to kill. The death of a mere branch family member wouldn't even be a stain on his record. For the crime of daring to ignore him and actually having the audacity to steal techniques from the Luxnick's main family, this was exactly what he deserved. Bang! A cloud of dust shot into the skies as the surrounding grass and soil catapulted upward. Raya's expression changed. Ah! She rushed forward, cutting through the plume of falling soil. But what she found on the other side froze her in her tracks. Alphen's back bent and a mouthful of blood shot from his lips like a bullet. Lionel stood over him, his fist still pointed downward and his gaze partially obscured by his dangling hair. Flickering bronze runes danced across his skin before they slowly faded, making them look no different from an illusion of the light. Alphen's right arm was bent at a disgusting angle, but this was the least of his problems. With the way his back contorted as it pressed into the ground, it was clear that his spine was deformed and practically all the bones of his torso were broken. Visit. For the best experience, Raya's chest heaved as Alphen's eyes rolled to the back of his head, looking into the sky with a face frozen of shock and fear. Raya's heart stopped beating entirely. A member of the branch family had just crippled a genius of the main family. It was all over. Chapter 11:20. Lionel's fist dripped with blood that wasn't his own, his forehead flickering with the light of a golden spear. In that moment he had activated his duality domain and, let alone harming Lionel, Alphen had had all his strength sucked away in an instant. Their exchange had become akin to a toddler throwing a fist at an adult. With the difference in the toughness of their bodies, Alphen was crushed near instantaneously. However, the smoldering abyss of Lionel's gaze didn't seem to calm in the slightest. He slowly rose to his full height as the loose soil fell back down to the earth and the true state of things was revealed to those beyond Raya. In that moment, the snide sneers of the two who had followed Alphen froze, their expressions warping. Lionel's gaze didn't spare them a glance. He simply turned and walked away. Raya was stunned. Why was he still acting like nothing had happened? Why wait? Raya called out, but she found Noah instead of her true target. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. I'm not sure if you want to be so eager to talk to him right now, honestly. He's not the biggest fan of you either. Raya choked on air. What the hell did she do? Her expression changed. She had felt a bit bad about what her grandmother was doing, but that was all. Maybe, on a deeper level, she felt that this was more of an opportunity for these branch family youths than a detriment. In many cases, those that thought and acted like her were the worst kind of people. They had enough sympathy to understand, but ultimately their own goals superseded whatever inner moral compass they had. Raya hadn't thought so deeply, so while she was off-put by Noah's words in the beginning, a slight resentment and an unwillingness to accept them came soon after. Her lips downturned into a frown as she immediately took the moral high ground. Do you have any idea what your cousin has done? Raya's head snapped back toward the two youths who still remained. But they had seemingly long taken their cue to run, not wanting to be the next victim. Raya immediately had thoughts of silencing them, but this was obviously not for Lionel's sake, but rather her own. The trouble that this event would bring wasn't something that her grandmother was ready to deal with just yet. This area had just taken the clash of two sixth-dimensional experts and yet no one had come to check up on them. The only reason why there was such damage here was because this soil was rich in nutrients and loose. its structural integrity was inherently not very high to begin with. That was to say that in such a sturdy sixth-dimensional world, the ripples of battle didn't carry very far. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience that seemed to make silencing these youth possible. But the issue was that too many had seen Raya go over to ask for help. And on top of that, these weren't nameless youths. They weren't anywhere near the top-line geniuses of the Luxnick's main family, but they still had quotas and responsibilities. Their absence would be noted. At best, she would be able to hide this matter for 2 or 3 days before it blew up in her face. And because she had silenced them, the backlash would be even worse. Damn it. There's no other choice but to let him take the fall for it. I have to inform grandmother so she can deal with the aftermath. If things aren't properly handled, grandma's enemies could use this to deal with us all. Noah simply gazed toward Raya and shook his head. Did the current Lionel seem like he cared about how much trouble he caused now? Lionel walked through the dining room and entered into the kitchen. Hey, what are you doing here? This place isn't. One of the many cooks of the courtyard frowned when they saw Lionel. They had all been preparing a large feast for the youths who were coming today, so they had already been working all day. All of them were force pill crafters, so it was safe to say that they had plenty of arrogance of their own. Though whether this arrogance was right or not was a different matter entirely. These were clearly still apprentice force pill crafters. Why would Fluttering Star Order truly go all out for a bunch of branch family youths? Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel, though, completely ignored them. His hand reached into an open oven with billowing flames and took out an enormous beast spread. The force pill crafter's expression warped. Originally, they had wondered if this young man had a death wish. The flames in that oven were enough to incinerate a fifth-dimensional beast to ash. Who in their right mind would reach their hands in there? Yet, not only had Lionel come out unscathed, his finger flickered with spear force several times to cut the beast carcass into edible chunks. Taking a massive silver plate for himself, he placed the pieces down and began to eat. From start to end, his slow and deliberate steps didn't seem to change. He walked out from the kitchen, his feet lighting up with sparkling lights. Hidden force arts of Raya's courtyard began to activate one after another. But after a subtle whirring noise, they calmed back down. Lionel cleaned bone after bone, his stomach churning like a furnace of its own. He subconsciously circulated a digestion technique of the Luxnicks, speeding up his already fast metabolism. One would have never thought that he was a person who had just sentenced himself to death. It was like he was truly strolling through his own home. Noah saw this scene and shook his head. Others saw leisure, but he saw a war machine restocking its fuel. The eerie efficiency, the unemotive and lack of care for the searing heat touching his fingers, the bloody juices that fell from the uncooked meat. A monster indeed. At that moment, a strong aura descended upon the courtyard. Visit. For a better user experience, grandmother. Raya finally sighed in relief. Chapter 11:21. Fluttering Star Order frowned. She hadn't expected to come back here so soon. It had only been barely a dozen or so minutes since she left, if that. Had this matter occurred just a few minutes later, she wouldn't have been able to return at all, as she had many things to handle with her status. At the same time, she was baffled by it all. How exactly had things gone awry so soon? Fluttering Star Order didn't immediately ask her granddaughter any questions and instead looked around. When she saw Alphen's half-dead body, her gaze narrowed. Raya, did you do this? Didn't I already warn you? No, grandmother. It wasn't me, that's the problem. It was one of the branch family youths. Fluttering Star Order's brows furrowed. Her immediate thought was that that was impossible. Even with what she had planned, it would take the entire month to squeeze out the potential of these youths. And even then, they would have to fight a long and drawn-out battle just to match a person like Alphen. The idea that one could defeat Alphen in just a dozen or so minutes made little to no sense. However, she didn't believe that her granddaughter would lie like this either. Raya knew how important these matters were to her, and she wouldn't mess around unnecessarily. Seeing her grandmother's confusion, Raya quickly described the events as succinctly as she could. It was only after this that Fluttering Star Order came to grasp the details. Unfortunately, this did nothing to alleviate her state. If what her granddaughter said was true, this would be troublesome. She agreed with Raya's decision to let the youths go. It would only make things worse to try to detain them or to even go as far as to silence them. But the weight of everything else would be troublesome. Visit. For a better user experience, there's only one choice then. This boy will have to bear the weight of his own actions. Fluttering Star Order didn't think much of Lionel's victory. Alphen was as average got in the Luxnick's main family. Plus, she had already noticed something off about Lionel and Noah after they withstood Elder Sparking's aura. As far as she was concerned, it was just a small surprise as well as a shame that Lionel didn't have the ability to control his temper. Obviously, Lionel could have been a great help to her granddaughter. Luckily there was still Noah. Hopefully he would bring her a pleasant surprise as well. Where is he? Come out. No. Just as Fluttering Star Order was about to force Lionel out, a sudden voice called out to her. Esteemed Elder, please wait. Fluttering Star Order's frown only deepened when she realized the one who had interrupted her was actually Kian, one of the branch family youths. In fact, he was from one of the top 3 branches Lionel had defeated before coming here. Everything had been happening so quickly that everyone almost forgot that there were still 20-odd youths in various states of injured waiting outside the courtyard. Most had recovered enough to stand, but the neglect they were experiencing was palpable. He only antagonized the healing arm member to help us. And he attacked him first. Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, it seemed to sap Kian of all his strength to say these words beneath Fluttering Star Order's gaze. That said, how could Fluttering Star Order have not already deduced these things? In her mind, it was likely that Lionel was a bastard child of someone of decent status within the main family. This individual likely broke the rules by giving Lionel a technique he shouldn't have, which led to this result. But now someone had to pay a price. Even if the Luxnick's family were magnanimous enough to treat the life of a main family member and a branch family member the same, and thus could grant Lionel reprieve since he was attacked first, what could be done about the core technique? This didn't even mention the fact the Luxnick's family would never see it like that, and that was especially so for Fluttering Star Order's enemies. The life of a branch family member could never match up to a main family member. It was to the point where Alphen wouldn't even be punished had Lionel died. Fluttering Star Order shook her head, causing the hearts of the youths to sink. She turned her attention back toward the courtyard, prepared to use her aura to coerce the youths out and make it clear that she had no intention of protecting Lionel, but who could have expected for Lionel to walk out himself? Fluttering Star Order opened her mouth to speak, but that was when Lionel's gaze swept over her. It wasn't just Lionel, but the little mink atop his head suddenly made her feel greatly uncomfortable. Little Blackstar bared his teeth, feeding off of Lionel's displeasure. Visit. For a better user experience in the end, though, Fluttering Star Order was still a Star Order elder who had experienced far too much life. Not only this, but she was well into the 6th dimension and could be considered to be only a few steps from the 7th as well. Her falter only lasted a split moment of a split moment. But by then, shockingly enough, Lionel had already looked away from her. He didn't seem to be looking for her approval, nor did he care what her judgment was. In that moment, a surge of snow force erupted, 2 magnificent wings appearing to Lionel's back, each one stretching out over 10 meters. With a single leap, both Lionel and Noah landed on top of the building, sitting near the edge as though they were waiting for something. Fluttering Star Order was stunned into silence. Those wings. Even though they were illusory, they would only appear when one was just a step away from the Speed Branch's 3rd awakening. What was going on here? Now Fluttering Star Order could understand why an elder would take the risk of giving their bastard child a core technique while breaking so many of the family rules in doing so. But that still didn't change anything. Fluttering Star Order's body flickered, her figure appearing above where Lionel and Noah now sat in wait. By the expression on her face, her patience was already wearing thin. She had endured so much humiliation over the last several decades just so that she could have this chance. She had no intention of allowing a brat who thought too much of himself to ruin it all. Her pressure descended downward like a tsunami of waves, her gaze as cold as ice. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 11:22. Lionel tilted his head upward, not even the slightest hint of a rippling wave to be found within his irises. Get the fuck out of my way. Despite what one would expect, there was nothing different about Lionel's voice. It hadn't deepened, it wasn't hoarse, it didn't carry any rage or forcefulness. One would have thought he was speaking about the weather. Fluttering Star Order was stunned by the evenness of it all at first. In fact, she was so stunned that she didn't register what was said until a moment later. It was only then that her stunned expression warped toward the edge of shock and then unbridled rage. No matter how mild-tempered Fluttering Star Order was, how could she still remain so now? Even her enemies didn't dare to speak to her in this way, least of all a junior she could kill with a single palm. Below, Raya's own expression changed. Did Lionel not understand the situation he was in? Even if her grandmother had no intention of saving him, she was still his only hope at coming out of this slightly less scathed. To slap the face of your potential benefactor like this, what was he thinking? Junior, do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Fluttering Star Order's words boomed, violent wind force spiraling about the surroundings. She bobbed in the skies as though she was as light as a feather, her fury on full display. Isn't it all the same? Lionel replied plainly. Aren't you all the same? Just more worthless people overvaluing themselves above others. Even I don't deem myself to be above another, what right do you have to? Visit. For a better user experience, Noah's expression changed wildly for the first time. His gaze snapped to Lionel's side profile as though he was looking at someone he didn't recognize in the slightest. Why did it feel like these words were both spoken by Lionel and someone who was decidedly not Lionel? It was as though he had taken on the character of someone completely different, but it was impossible to tell until he opened his mouth to speak. What did you just say to me? Fluttering Star Order couldn't withhold her fury any longer. Her palm raised into the skies with every intention of obliterating Lionel where he stood. However, Lionel's words seemed to continue like a slow stream, unhurried and unbothered. I don't know much about force pill crafting, but I can recognize breaking force when I see it. To have prepared so many force herbs infused with such force, what were your plans exactly? To squeeze out all the potential of us branch family members? Fluttering Star Order froze. And then what? Have us ride the wave of excitement, being ever thankful to the Luxnick's main family for our rapid improvement? Maybe we would even be so grateful that we would lay our lives on the line for the sake of glory your granddaughter would be the greatest partaker of? Now that I think about it, maybe those of us that died would be the luckier ones, because those who survived would soon find that they wouldn't be able to progress even a single step afterward. They would probably end up thrown to the side like useless trash after you were finished, right? Fluttering Star Order's lashes fluttered. She was ultimately not a person who was so ruthless. It was easy for her to deal with the guilt when no one else was aware of it, but having things so blatantly laid out like this, she felt a deep shame. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel had simply learned too much about breaking force in recent months. And using his dream sculpt and dream simulation abilities, deducing the end result was as easy as breathing. Not all breaking force was created equal. Lionel completely ignored Fluttering Star Order's internal struggle, his foot lightly tapping the roof of the large mansion. In that moment, the ground began to rumble, for enormous pillars beginning to rise up from the earth. They all shimmered with a blinding silver luster, etched with all sorts of ancient and enigmatic patterns. Fluttering Star Order's expression changed. She couldn't really grasp what was going on, but as someone with high snow force affinity, her internal sight was likewise powerful. She gained a general understanding in just a breath. Lionel breathed out a heavy breath, showing the first signs of an emotion for the last several moments. However, it wasn't anger, relief or happiness. Rather, it was just fatigue, something so rudimentary that even a beast could have displayed it. And yet, right then, an inconspicuous necklace around his neck began to glow as force surged toward it, slowly replenishing Lionel. When you go, Lionel began to state plainly, his palm flipping over to reveal the Northern Star pendant, tell your counterparts that I've come for what's mine. When I go. Wait, is that? At that moment, a gripping force took hold of Fluttering Star Order's body. A strong spatial force caught her completely off guard. Before she realized what was happening, her body flickered and disappeared. Visit. For a better user experience, when Fluttering Star Order reappeared, she found herself in a random corner of the Luxnick's estate, an expression of shock plastered onto her wizened features. My counterparts? What counterparts do I still have? Grandma? What did you do to my grandmother? Raya's shrill cry came from below. But, if even a Star Order elder could be teleported away, if Lionel didn't want her to move, she wouldn't move. Lionel stood atop the mansion as though he hadn't heard a thing Raya said. His expression was just as indifferent as always, the abyss that was his gaze staring off into the distance. No one could tell what he was thinking. Noah's looked toward the pillars. He could tell that even now, Lionel hadn't quite recovered from summoning them, but this only left him speechless. Just what was Lionel planning on doing here, exactly? At that moment, a commotion in the distance was stirred. Two familiar figures leading a group of at least 20 quickly closed the distance, their expressions livid. Raya's face warped, her heart skipping several beats. She recognized many of those seniors. What they lacked in talent they more than made up for in seniority and time spent practicing. Among them, there was even the current head of Alphen's division of the healing arm, the quasi-sixth dimensional division head Darren. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 11:23. Raya's expression was filled with panic. This matter had already blown up far faster than she had expected. For a division head to already be making an appearance was far out of her predictions. It felt like everything was coming crumbling down. Division head Thurin's expression didn't give much away initially. He had a placid look on his face. He only showed the slightest hint of a frown when he noticed the 4 enormous silver pillars that surrounded the courtyard. He could sense the strong spatial and earth force fluctuations, and it left his heart unsettled. He came to a stop outside the pillars, his gaze sweeping over to find a small pit where Alphen's body lay, still deformed. No one had come to help him ever since his exchange with Lionel. And if not for the strong healing properties of Snow Force, it may very well have been the case that he would have already breathed his last. What is the meaning of this? Darren asked coldly. In truth, he had only overheard part of the story. Even Alphen himself didn't have the right to ask a division head for backup, let alone his 2 lackeys. As a result, all Darren knew was that a branch family member had attempted to murder a main family member. Learning this, he was immediately furious. Hierarchy was among the most important things a family should have. A lack of it would lead to far more trouble than it was worth. A collapse in hierarchy would lead to the downfall of a family not long later. However, in his fury he hadn't considered the details. And now that he saw these pillars, he felt that this matter would be even more troublesome than he thought. Division head, it's him. He's the one who struck to kill Alphen. 2 fingers found their way to Lionel, who was still on the roof. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. At this moment, Lionel was still just as difficult to read. He stood on the roof, his breathing slowly becoming even once more, but it felt as though his eyes were detached from the rest of his body. Despite his fatigue, they were completely unaffected by it, their deep abyss only becoming deeper. Even now, as he swept a glance over the 20 or so individuals who had come, he felt unmoved by it all. What did he want to accomplish here? What was his end goal? Truthfully, he didn't know. Destroying the Luxnix family? That was more than just a little unlikely. He didn't have the strength to do it, and it likely wouldn't be a very long time until he did. Make those responsible pay? He was just as far away from that goal as well. If Noah's story was anything to go by, it was precisely the most powerful of the Luxnix who were at fault to begin with. Vent his fury? Well, that didn't sound so bad. Now did it? Lionel's figure suddenly flickered and vanished. Twinkling stars were left in his original position, a strong surge of wind manifesting as he reappeared. The sound of a suffocated gurgle resounded. Division head Thurin's head slowly turned, only to find Lionel's hand clamped down on the throat of the 2 who had just been pointing at him. Visit. For the best no understanding experience, he had appeared within their midst like a shadow. Even though he was a division head of the healing arm, Darren immediately recognized when he saw it. Lionel's proficiency in using it was so astounding that even he hadn't been able to react in time. The 2 young men gripped at their throats, but Lionel's hand had already cut off blood circulation to their brains. They couldn't even think straight, failing to dredge up their force in time or even remember the techniques they had learned. There was something about Lionel's gaze that made them forget everything, as though they were beasts meeting the king of the forest. They foamed at the mouth, their flailing legs going limp. In that moment, Darren finally reacted. Humiliation and rage bubbled up, his expression twisting and reddening all at once. How dare you? A strong surge of force erupted about him, his fist blasting through the air and piercing through Lionel's skull. The enraged glint in his eye only grew fiercer when he saw that Lionel failed to dodge. However, the feeling of emptiness his knuckles felt made his expression change once more. Lionel stood there, unmoving. Or so it seemed. Half his face, the portion Thurin's fist had punched through, was nothing more than sparkling motes of light. As for the other half, his one eye gazed toward Darren without the slightest ripple. It felt to the division head that he was an ant being observed by the wayside. His heart leapt to his throat, his breathing becoming short and hurried. He recognized the technique almost immediately. It was visit. For a better user experience just like that in just a few minutes, Lionel had used, and the first was one of the strongest techniques of the healing arm, the next was one of the strongest movement techniques of the speed branch, and the last was known as the most difficult technique to learn within the fifth dimension of the wisdom branch. Theron was at a loss. Exchanging for these techniques was one thing, it would usually take a person decades to accumulate enough merits. But actually learning them to this extent was a completely different matter entirely. Just who was this boy? Bang. The air shot out of Theron's lungs all at once, spittle and a concentrated wind projectile shooting from his mouth as he flew back. The image of Lionel he had punched through slowly dissipated, the real form of Lionel appearing, the fist he had just used to punch the division head still hanging in the air. Theron blasted through the entourage he had brought around before skidding along the ground. By now, no matter how good a sixth-dimensional world was at dispersing the signs of battle, the movement of a division head wouldn't go unnoticed as more and more people started to turn their attention toward this courtyard. Theron's gaze turned crimson, his snow force blossoming forth as he stood to his feet. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing a 3-meter-long silver spear as his skin flickered with bronze runes. Visit. For the best no_underscore_underscore experience, a strong gravitational domain fell from the skies, streaks of black lines pressuring the integrity of space itself. Lionel's foot raised, his body flickering once more. Chapter 11:24. When Lionel reappeared, he had already donned a silver armor from head to toe, a visor of silver black blocking his abyssal gaze from the world. Theron felt a pressure the likes of which he hadn't felt in countless years. How long had it been since he was forced into such a battle? He had long since stopped having to scratch and claw for his position in life, and even back when he still had to, his role had never been so violent or necessary. The bloodlust coming from Lionel's body was practically palpable. It was as though the moment his gaze vanished, taking with it the distraction that froze the heart of the world, the tangible form of what had taken root in his chest was bared for all to see. King's might rolled off of him in waves, his very consciousness itself constricting the throats of those unlucky enough to lay eyes on him. And then his spear swung down. Theron's throat squeezed down on itself, his rage almost evaporating into the skies above. It was only then that a strong will to live manifested out from the depths of his soul. He roared. But it was as much about shaking the fear from himself, as though cobwebs fogging his mind, as it was about asserting his dominance. The snow force that had receded under his apprehension came back twice as strong, his palm flipping over to reveal a flexible sword that shot out like a whip with just the slightest flick of his wrist. The sword had always been a favorite of the Luxniks. It could be said that over 90% of their weapon-type techniques were constructed with the sword in mind. And, of those 90%, another 90% focused on the speed of said sword. It could be said that among the pinnacle sixth-dimensional families, the Luxniks had the swiftest blade. Clang. Lionel's spear spun in his hands, his downward swing becoming a frontal block that deflected Theron's own blade to the side. A golden spear lit upon his forehead, its light growing ever brighter with each passing moment. Visit. For a better user experience, Theron's wrist and forearm quaked every time his sword clashed with Lionel. Despite the size difference of their weapons, he couldn't seem to gain a speed advantage. And when it came to strength, momentum and heft, Lionel seemed to surpass in him all aspects. Under the astonished gazes of those who had come with the division head, including Raya who still couldn't seem to move, Theron was forced back again and again. Lionel's spear spun around his back. The clink of a mechanism unlocking as the opposite end snapped into his other palm resoundingly. Lionel held onto both ends of his spear, the chain that connected them dangling behind him. His fighting style changed, his speed becoming even quicker. Both of his hands seemed to have gained minds of their own, and in the blink of an eye, Theron's speed advantage vanished. The silvery splendor of Lionel's spear suddenly gained an all-new shine to it. Natural spear force erupted, every arc leaving crescent moon blades slicing through the air. The canvas of white, silver and blacks left a trail through the battlefield. Every action Lionel took was taken with such speed that only these swath of colors were left behind. And every swing of his blades left an indelible mark on the surroundings. Theron lost the initiative and never regained it. Slicing arcs of blood traveled around and up his forearms, even his robes themselves being torn to tatters. He didn't even have the presence of mind to try and grasp how Lionel had even learned. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Theron roared in pain, humiliation and rage. He couldn't seem to get any leg up on Lionel. He was faster, smarter and stronger. Every time Theron thought he could counter, he hit nothing but an illusion. Every time he was forced to clash head-on, he was sent sprawling back. Every time he tried to maintain some distance to gain some breathing room, Lionel would already appear before him a moment later. It was infuriating to an astounding degree. Theron suddenly froze. His head slowly turned to his right shoulder, only to find a vast emptiness. His arm twirled in the air, separated from the socket it should have been resting in, and his sword barely clinging to the palm of it. A sharp arc of pain rocked his senses when the familiar sensation was doubled with his left shoulder. Before he could process what was happening, a foot was firmly planted into his chest, his body shooting backward as a trail of blood spurted out in his wake. Trash. The word drifted to Theron's ears even in his half-stunned state. It infuriated him so much that a third projectile of blood shot outward, this time from his mouth. Visit. For the best no underscore experience, Lionel watched indifferently as Theron skidded along the ground, painting the picturesque scenery of the Luxnix family estate in crimson. He simply couldn't understand why people as weak and inferior as Theron deemed themselves to be oh so great and important. When Theron went about his daily life, there were probably dozens, hundreds of people, even that he would interact with that he could only greet humbly. And yet he came here to flaunt what exactly? Theron continued to cough up blood violently. He wanted nothing more than to tear Lionel limb from limb, but he had actually lost so thoroughly. Use the command token. Use it now. Theron's furious howl traveled through the air before dispersing into the clouds. The students of his department all put on shocked expressions before they scrambled to complete his order, each quickly pulling out a talisman. At that moment, at a gate entrance different from the one Lionel and the others had entered, a convoy of men and women from the Viola family were making their presence known. Richard stood at the helm of the group. Please inform your elders that the crown heir of the Viola family has something to discuss with them. Hearing these words, the guards didn't dare to dally and quickly left to do as they were told. Visit. For the best no experience within this convoy, there were many youthful faces. Among them, there were 3 young women Lionel would instantly recognize, one of whom was a woman he wasn't quite sure how to face just yet. Chapter 11:25. The sight of numerous talismans being activated at once was ironically quite beautiful despite the purpose they were meant to serve. In the Luxnix main family there were numerous bodies or powers. First there were the 3 arms, then there was the Elders' Council, the Feathersword Warriors, the Star Order Council, and finally the Patriarch's faction. These 7 facets of the family worked in a balance and counterbalance sort of way. The Star Order Council, the Patriarch's faction and the Feathersword Warriors could be considered the high end of this balance. There were many push and pull effects that dictated the politics. At the lower levels though there were the 3 arms and the Elders' Council. Of course, these 3 arms were the Wisdom Arm, the Healing Arm and the Speed Arm. These 3 arms were overseen by the Elders' Council, a group of seniors that weren't good enough to enter the true elite ranks of the main family, but still had strength given by their seniority and age nonetheless. This was important to understand at this point because it also described the weight of this command token. The so-called command token was known by many things, but it was essentially a breadth of authority given to those of a certain rank. As a division head, a high-level position of the 3 arms, Theron was, of course, given this authority. With how the Luxnix were designed, it was no surprise that they promoted competition. At the lower levels, this competition manifested in the head-butting of the 3 arms. Sometimes this internal struggle would travel up to the Elder Council who had once been part of the 3 arms themselves, but this was much rarer. Visit. For the best no experience, simply put, battles between the arms was not rare in the slightest. The command token was used when these situations grew to a level that large portions of the arm would become involved. The call of a division head was enough to spring several talents of the healing arm into action. The trouble was that middling talents like Alphen wouldn't be the only ones alerted. In a corner of the Luxnix family estate, a young man stood in the middle of an empty training field. Beads of sweat poured down his body, yet his eyes were unblinking and his sword was steady. He was about to take a step forward when he frowned. He trained topless, but he still had his spatial ring and some ornaments on him. As a force of habit he never took them off. But he was still baffled when he saw the pendants swinging from his hip glowing. What are these fools doing? It's only a month out from the selection and they've sparked a faction war? Visit. For a better user experience, this young man was none other than the 3rd youth to have a bloodline density of above 0.50 Elodie Luxnix. Like Siller of the Speed branch and Eloquent of the Wisdom branch, Elodie was the preeminent genius of the healing branch and had completed the first awakening of his healing branch. Instant recovery. Elodie wasn't in the mood to deal with such things. So much of his time in the last several weeks had been spent on entertaining Orinik and Ganner, the two galaxy-ranked disciples of the Void Palace. He hardly had time for himself. And yet, now that he finally found such time, some idiot had used the command token? Elodie was of the mind to completely ignore it. He did have a responsibility as the head of the healing branch to show up for these matters when their small internal battles rose to this level, but it wasn't strictly necessary either way. It wasn't like any of them could reprimand him. He shook his head. Forget it, I won't go. What a waste of my time. Even as he thought this, Elodie hesitated once more. If a command token had been used, it was possible that one of the other heads was involved. If Siller and Eloquin were participating, it might be worth his while to spar with them. It had been quite a long time since he did so. Oh wait. It'll be obvious soon if they participated or not. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Elodie went back to swinging his sword. Elodie wasn't the only one who noticed the sudden commotion. The flare-up of a command token was something designed to be seen by as many as possible, and many stragglers of the other two arms were alerted to the change as well. In an irony of ironies, a command token meant to be used to signal battle between two arms was not only sparked by just a single man, but it had suddenly put all three arms into motion, as neither the wisdom nor speed arm was aware of just which of them was going to be attacked. A surge of speed-armed disciples rushed for Raya's courtyard, their gazes practically crimson with pent-up energy. Many of these youths were individuals who knew well that the Void Palace was selecting disciples, but they were simultaneously aware that they would never be among the selected. This sort of existential nihilism, although in just small measures, had been building up among the average of the Luxniks for the past several weeks now. Suddenly having gained a target to vent their feelings of inadequacy on, they didn't even care to consider which arm they were fighting or if they were battling an arm at all. Only a few who had witnessed Thurin's tirade earlier that day connected the dots toward what might actually be happening, but even they followed along, wanting to vent that uncomfortable feeling in their hearts. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience soon, over the horizon from Raya's courtyard, dozens of youths became hundreds. The spectators that had been slowly accumulating grew in number as well. Lionel stood in silence, the two ends of his spear in hand, still linked by a chain and separated into three. He hadn't made any move to stop Thurin's commands or the others. Today he would flip the Luxniks family estate on its head. Chapter 11:26. The surge of youths with crimson eyes flooded the battlefield. But the targets they were looking for didn't seem to be anywhere to be found. All they saw were the littered and bloody bodies of their fellow Healing Arm members and a single silver-armored man standing before a courtyard surrounded by 4 silver pillars. Many of them were confused, but even more of them seemed to realize that their enemy was precisely this silver-armored man. Kill him. Thurin's enraged roar shook those who were confused out of this state. However, when they heard Thurin call for murder, they were shocked. Though it wasn't like no one had ever died in a faction war, it was still rare. On top of that, it was quite frowned upon. These were the types of things the Elders' Council would step in to stop. That said, while there were many who stood frozen, there were even more that didn't need to be told twice. Their egos had been poked and prodded at for too long, and it was already clear to them that a division head of their arm had actually been crippled. This sort of humiliation wasn't something they were willing to let go, even if they weren't already in such a strung-up state. They charged forward like a tide, the ground rumbling as large swaths of snow force rippled throughout at the air. Lionel's chest rose, a sizzling heat at his right hip threatening to tear a hole through his own body. But for some reason it felt good. Felt almost too good. It fed off of Lionel's angst, his fury, his indifference. It swallowed up all that was him and churned out a result that fed into the very fabric of his king's might. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience these hundreds of youths? Just wasn't enough. Bang. Lionel's foot rose and fell. In that moment, a tidal wave of earth shot out from the ground. First, there was a sprinting set of spiderweb-like cracks, folding and bending the earth to Lionel's will. And then, in the next moment, they shot upward, crashing into the first line of charging Healing Arm warriors and throwing whatever semblance of unity and formation they had into absolute chaos. Lionel's figure vanished. When he reappeared once more, the falling debris of earth sprinkled about him like the ashes of war. Without the immediate support of the man or woman next to them, the Healing Arm could only face the carnage they wrought. Lionel's blades flashed, his body flickering and disappearing at will, only to appear and vanish once more. Arcs of blood and crimson followed his path, limbs and horrid screams leaving landmarks of his presence. Lionel used the techniques of the Luxniks seamlessly one after another. It felt as though there were dozens of him and his every action incapacitated another. Blood flowed in rivers and bones formed the earth. As the curtain of dirt finally descended and the vision of those around cleared to what was happening, half of the healing arm warriors had already been cut down, their lives' blood fueling the soil beneath their immobile bodies. Visit. For the best understanding experience, a look of absolute horror was painted on the faces of those who headed the initial charge, at least those of them that had survived, anyway. From the rooftop, Noah watched on, sighing every so often. He could tell at a glance that Lionel wasn't overpowering them with raw strength. If he tried to fight these many talents head-on, he would have been cut down long ago. It was just that. Lionel was just so much smarter with how he used his strength. Noah knew the techniques Lionel was using as well. He too had received those gifts. Was a technique that applied one's internal sight to trick the senses of others. It was ironically useless against those who purely relied on their five senses in battle, but which expert wouldn't subconsciously use their internal sight to boost their senses? This overlay of what the body was recognizing and what one's soul force was seeing led to a cognitive dissonance that easily formed illusions of starlight in battle. The more powerful and deft one's control of their internal sight was, the more deadly the technique. However, to use it with such skill, and especially against so many enemies, Lionel had to be capable of calculating the perspective of each and every person on the battlefield at the same time. Only then would he be able to execute in the most optimal manner. Simply put, he was like a machine. Noah had yet to see a swing of Lionel's blade not draw blood. Lionel's gaze flickered with coldness, his every breath becoming so heated that steam billowed from his mouth. His skin reddened and his armor began to glow with a rosy silvery hue. Visit. For a better user experience, the temperature in his surroundings skyrocketed, yet Lionel only felt more and more comfortable. Lionel's blade blocked a sword from one direction, his free hand hacking down and severing the forearm that carried it. His movements became faster and more fluid, his want for destruction and violence billowing off of him in waves. The heat became so searing that the warriors of the healing arm couldn't get close to him without using force skins. However, their wants and needs didn't cross Lionel's mind in the slightest. In that moment, a furious howl left his lips. It brought with it such momentum that violent concentric circles of pulsing air billowed from Lionel's mouth. Bang! Lionel's aura erupted, force shattering the ground beneath his feet. The momentum of a Tier 2 expert rose from him, shattering the barrier that had held him back and multiplying his strength several times over. The shackles that held down Lionel's body were being loosened one after another, his howl carrying with it a scorching heat that rose into the skies. Visit. For a better user experience, the atmosphere seemed to be affected, rolling clouds of gray responding and slowly beginning to gather. At that moment, several division heads of the healing arm finally reached the battlefield. When they saw the state of things, their eyes widened, a furious light sparking within their gaze. Chapter 11:27. The division heads were furious, but they weren't fools. Having seen the state of the battlefield, they knew that it would take someone at least as powerful as them to leave these unranked students in such a state. The arms had three sectors within them. There were the division heads, the unranked students, and finally the rankers. Number one among these rankers was the head of the arm, and there were three of them in total. Of course, these men were Siller, Eloquent, and Elodie. The other rankers were reserved for students ranked in the top 1,000. When one reached deep into the hundreds of these ranks, despite being a lower tier than that of the division heads, the students themselves were considered equals. Above this, the rankers could dwarf and even one-shot division heads. Rankers were the pool from which future Feather Sword warriors were chosen, and it was impossible to enter the Patriarch's faction or the Star Order if you had not been a ranker in the past. This was all to say that despite feeling the endless vitality coming from Lionel, and being certain that he was exceptionally young despite being unable to see his face, the division heads didn't make the mistake of underestimating him. In the Luxniks family, strength wasn't decided by how old you were. It was decided by your ability. At the helm of the division heads there were three. These were men who had been in the outskirts of the rankers in their youth but weren't quite good enough to become Feather Sword warriors. In addition, because they were so young, they couldn't join the Elders' Council just yet either. Compared to the other division heads, They were several decades younger and they saw through their present situation with just a glance. They were Rainer, Ingram and Samson, a trio of division heads that usually acted as a trump card for these faction wars. But it seemed like this matter wouldn't be able to be handled by them. They had no idea who this silver-armored warrior was, but they could smell the danger. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_g experience, send the signal again. Samson said with narrowed eyes. But another division head tried dissent. No buts. Those rankers and especially not our arm head would never come out normally. This battle isn't simple and I'm getting a bad feeling from those pillars and that little beast on his head. If we don't make sure that they know this matter is serious, they'll never come. All of them had a mightier and higher than thou attitude. They would always wait until the last moment to swoop in and see if it was worth getting in on the action. But if things continued like this, their healing arm wouldn't even have anyone left. Rainer, Ingram, we need to take the helm. The two division heads nodded, their auras silently brewing as the other division heads did as they were told. In that instant, a second round of signals were sparked and sent into the air. Lionel's hand released one of his blades. With a sharp tug, he pulled on the other side, sending his spear spinning outward in a wide arc everywhere the blade passed. An arc of crimson would follow. The range of the spear had increased by a factor of 10, its chain stretching outward as much as 30 meters under Lionel's control. Visit. For a better user experience with a flick of his wrist, the spear snapped backward. A resounding and satisfying clicking sound echoed across the battlefield as it shot back into place, leaving the afterimages of a silver crescent moon in its wake. The grass beneath Lionel's feet began to wither and fall to ash, small sparks of fire dancing about and spreading into the surroundings. His steps were slow as he walked toward the division heads, the little mink upon his head baring his fangs menacingly. A shimmering golden spear pulsed upon Lionel's forehead, an invisible domain spreading out with his body as the center. It sounded like the whirring of a magnetic field coming to life, just the slightest and faintest purple hue coating the surroundings as the clouds above continued to gray. The lush and beautiful atmosphere of the Luxnick's family estate was withering away one step at a time. Blood pooled the ground, flames licked away at the foliage and the skies slowly darkened, a slight drizzle beginning to pitter-patter. The first droplet that fell upon Lionel jumped about wildly, reaching a boiling point in an instant and evaporating into nothingness. At first, there was only the slightest hint of steam, but as the rain began to grow heavier, the billowing plumes of water vapor grew more and more prominent until it seemed like Lionel himself was made of smoke. Casually using sword techniques was fine against the others, but facing these three he felt the call of a sharper force. The duality spear vibrated wildly like a beast pulling against its chain. The billowing fog shot up around it, allowing its blade to split it in two. The instant the duality domain crossed the three division heads, Lionel vanished. When he reappeared, he was already at Samson's throat, his spear blade threatening to take ahead with its swing. Visit. For a better user experience, Samson's pupils constricted, but his reaction was calm. His task wasn't to win, all he had to do was stall. That was all. Just stall. Stall until they could get here. But what was this piercing pain? Samson's sword had shot forward to intercept Lionel's spear and even successfully parried it. So what was this searing heat he felt in his opposite shoulder? Samson's eyes widened. In that moment, a three-pronged strike shot out from in front of him and carried into the distance, leaving deep trenches in the ground and causing an explosion of earth and taking with it a spiraling arm and a thread of crimson. Little Blackstar bared his shimmering teeth, his little claws still being held up in a swiping position. Samson felt a foot land on his knee in his distraction, a violent pain erupting throughout his body as his leg was shattered. By the time he had collapsed to the ground, Lionel had already flashed and vanished once more. The latest _IP_SODIes are on the website. Chapter 11:28. Ingram and Rainer felt their souls leave their bodies. They hadn't even sensed when the little mink attacked, but in that moment they felt as though there wasn't a single thing they could do to fight back against it. Light force should have been the perfect counter to dark elemental force. But why was it that it felt like the exact opposite right now? The group of division heads fell into absolute chaos. It was clear that Lionel's speed in dealing with these enemies had fallen drastically, but none of his fire had waned. In fact, with every passing moment, it felt as though Lionel was quickly becoming a rising star of his own. The rain became heavier and the steam became denser. Soon it was difficult to see just 3 meters ahead of you. Without a choice, the division heads could only rely on their internal sight, but it was then that they realized that this was the worst decision they could have possibly made. In that moment, it felt like Lionel was both everywhere and nowhere all at once. Trails of sparkling star force sprinkled about the battlefield, giving it a beauty that didn't match the carnage it was experiencing. Limbs flew about and cries of pain pierced the veil. Ingram and Raynor managed to survive the first exchange. Now that they were keenly aware of the danger of the little mink, they split their attention between Lionel and Little Blackstar, unwilling to end up like their counterpart had. When these two formed a team, the strength they displayed wasn't just additive. However, in all their caution, they didn't realize just how many of their fellow division heads were being cut down by Lionel himself. "Damn it," Ingram growled. He pulled out a second sword, a light silver glow wrapping around him. They couldn't allow things to continue like this. The familiar sequence of took form. The latest _sodies are on the website. Cover me. Raynor didn't need to be told twice, pulling out a white leather whip from his hip. His gaze sharpened, a silver force wafting out from them. His vision brightened. From being able to see just 3 meters, he could now see through the entirety of the steam without issue. Ingram crossed Lionel's path, blocking him from crippling yet another division head. His twin blades moved with a practiced smoothness, alternating his speed with the expertise of a veteran. He had learned long ago that pushing your speed to the limit all the time didn't make you a better sword master. Oftentimes, lulling your opponent into one set rhythm before instantaneously changing it at the right time was far better. However, Ingram very quickly found out that such tricks were worthless before Lionel. In fact, using a technique that Lionel was familiar with before him was akin to courting death. The flat of Lionel's blade skimmed against the sharp edge of Ingram's sword, parrying it upward. The golden spear upon his forehead flashed as he took an instep, counterintuitively giving up his range advantage as a spearman. However, from this vantage point, Raynor's whip had instantly been rendered useless. Lionel's gaze flashed, his spear vanishing. His fist hit Ingram squarely in the chest before the latter could react, causing an upswell of blood to fly from his throat. Being hit in the chest, Ingram found the swinging motion of his second sword completely off course. He thought that it was a coincidence at first, but the violent breaking of his rib cage and the tenderizing of his muscles made his arms all but useless. As though Lionel's fists weren't heavy enough, Ingram found that the space behind him had stacked several times. Lionel's spatial domain had made the several-meter distance to Ingram's back as much as several hundred meters. In the end, Ingram, who should have been flying back at astonishing speed, had practically become a practice dummy, his chest deforming as craters the size of fists formed within it. The latest _sodies are on the website. Bang. Ingram's body finally shot out, appearing before Raynor in an instant. The stacking of space had immediately been reversed and shortened instead, resulting in the latter being caught completely off guard. Raynor felt all the air in his body shoot out in a torrent, spittle flying from his mouth as his tongue hung outside. In that moment, the robes protecting Ingram's chest burst into flames and fell into a pile of ashes. Within the 4 pillars, the Branch family youths, Noah, and especially Raya, were at a loss for words. They could hardly see what was happening within all that billowing fog, but every so often someone frantic and screaming would run out for their lives, rushing away as fast as their legs would allow them. Lionel appeared above Raynor and Ingram. The depth of his gaze was filled with a blinding crimson light, the smallest hint of violet fighting for a small corner along the outer edges. He raised his spear above his head, prepared to swing downward with the same fiery momentum he had been slowly building up. Even his spear itself had begun to glow with a slight rosiness, impacted by the heat coming from Lionel. Bang! At that moment, an arrow suddenly shot through the billowing steam. However, without even looking in that direction, Lionel rose his left hand out and to the side, his palm flipping over to reveal an long sniper rifle. Light elemental force whirred to life and several complex shield-shaped yellow crystal formations appeared before the barrel, each preceding one larger than the last. Visit. For a better user experience by the end of it, the large yellow crystal shield was over 3 meters in diameter, dwarfing a human in size. And then, Lionel squeezed the trigger. A blinding beam of light shot out from the barrel, blasting into the first of the 10 yellow crystal shields. The light was instantly absorbed by it, moving within its structure so quickly that it looked like a pinball fighting for its life. And then, the light shot out and entered the second shield. Then the third. It all happened in the blink of an eye. By the time the light exited the 10th shield, it was so thick and fast that the clouds above split, the rain dispersing entirely. The arrow that had just shot into the wall of fog was incinerated before it even reached the beam of light. The space quaked and the fog domain was vanquished with a loud whoosh. The beam illuminated the whole of the Luxnix estate, piercing through the air with a speed impossible to track with the eye. Shit. The archer, Ranker 302, only had time for her heart to tremble once. The latest _sodies are on the website. Her right shoulder was blasted through, a bowl-sized hole taking her arm and a piece of her collarbone along with it. The fog completely dispersed, revealing Lionel standing amidst hundreds of fallen. The ground beneath his feet dyed red and his breathing still billowing outward with piping hot steam. Chapter 11:29. In that moment, Ranker 302 fell backward and collapsed, the rankers around her still not having registered exactly what happened. It had all happened so fast that it was all still not computing. She had only just released her arrow, but in the next moment she had a hole through her chest. Ranker 302 gasped for air, but her attempts all came out in gurgles as the viscous liquid filled her lungs. Damn it. Someone heal her. This son of a bitch. They were still ultimately the healing branch of the family, and the best among the healing arm at that. However, when they bent down to help their fellow ranker, their expressions couldn't help but change. A violent aura of destruction ate at her wounds. As though a fire had started, her skin was slowly being burnt away. If things continued like this and the corrosion made it to her heart, she might really die. Reacting quickly, a young man, Ranker 239, brandished his sword, cutting away the flesh that was being eaten away at. Only after doing this was the healing process able to continue. Unfortunately, they didn't have the ability to regrow limbs and too much of her arm had been destroyed. But she would still have a chance in the future so long as she continued down this path and awakened her healing branch. With instant recovery, she would be able to make her body whole again. There's something wrong with this light force. Ranker 239 spoke. It has the speed of snow force, but snow force doesn't have these corrosive properties. It simply doesn't make any sense. If Becca was taken out so quickly, would be going over there just to die. The top 100 need to move out. The latest _sodies are on the website. Silence fell over the group, but they too agreed. They were just a bit over 2 kilometers away from the battlefield, standing atop a tall community building. When they received the second signal, they had thought the division heads were too useless and Becca even bet that she could take out the enemy with a single arrow. Just moments ago, they had even been happily betting on how many it would really take her. Though they showed disdain for the division heads, they still had a baseline of reason to their opinions. Some thought that it would at least take Becca 3 arrows to win. If it was within a kilometer, then maybe only then would they agree that it would only take 1. But who would have thought that Becca would end up in such a state barely a split moment after the twang of the bow reached their ears? It almost felt like they were dreaming. That beam caused too much commotion. If I'm correct, everyone in at least a 50-kilometer radius felt that. If they didn't take it seriously before, they definitely will now. A ranker that had remained silent until now, Ranker 129, looked into the distance with narrowed eyes. They're already here. What these few didn't know was that they were very lucky. In a 6-dimensional world, Lionel didn't have the range or stamina to sustain his internal sight to a 2-kilometer range. He had dealt with Becca using the trajectory of her arrow. If not for this, she wouldn't be the only one on the ground. Visit. For the best no underserving experience, the fog violently dispersed as though a speeding bullet train had just run through it, the clouds above splitting beneath the surging momentum of the beam of gold. The ground beneath Lionel's feet had burnt to black. From above it looked like the lush and vibrant lands of the Luxnix were slowly being corrupted one step at a time. Both Ingram and Raynor collapsed before Lionel, completely unable to move. Just the slightest breath from them imprinted every one of their broken bones into their minds, as though countless needles were being pierced through their bodies all at once. The atmosphere seemed to grow heavier all of a sudden. Though Lionel didn't turn his back to where it was coming from, he could see it all almost as though his own eyes were watching it. Several small groups leisurely walked toward the battlefield. Some were alone, but many more were in groups of 2 or 3. Judging by the smiles on their faces and their casual attitudes, they hadn't been doing anything very serious before coming here. Compared to those Lionel had already fought, their power levels seemed to be far worse off. Lionel had already defeated dozens of quasi-6-dimensional division heads, and yet within these many groups he was currently observing, even the best of them were only tier 6 or 7. Some of the worst off were only tier 3 or 4. And yet, The pressure they gave off versus that of their division heads was practically night and day. Lionel slowly lowered his sniper rifle, allowing the barrel to rest against the ground. Though these individuals had walked into the range of his internal sight and he no longer needed to rely on their attacking first to respond, he knew that this weapon he had created while he was still in the fourth dimension would be useless against these geniuses. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Lionel exhaled another long breath. 4 seasons. Time seemed to slow for just a moment. The sky was instantly filled with fluttering fall leaves, droplets of golden rain and quivering snowflakes of ash. As the ground continued to blacken beneath the heat Lionel was emitting, there was something decidedly beautiful about it all. 9 radiant cores manifested, glowing with a silvery crimson light. They formed into an orbiting circle, rotating about Lionel's back as though they had a mind of their own. The golden droplets pelted against the ground, dotting the blackness with the heaviness of gold, even as the 4 silver pillars finally began to quake. One after another, bubbles began to form on the surface of the spatial wall encasing Raya's courtyard. Small S carrying the slightest violet tinge popped out, forming numerous crystal balls of all sizes. The space around Lionel had suddenly become a wonderland of gorgeous sights. But the scent of danger in the air was practically palpable. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 11:30. Lionel turned, his sniper rifle vanishing. The slight sound of a blade sharpening resounded, but what was truly baffling was that Lionel's spear hadn't touched a single thing. The sound echoed once more and then again. It felt like one was watching a master at work, a blade slowly gliding against a whetstone gently. The blade slowly gained an edge of its own, the slight flicker of the master's wrist bending it to his will. The leisurely expressions of the approaching rankers grew serious when they heard this sound, but it only seemed to continue. Xing Shuring Shine, pick up the blade. Gently apply pressure. Glide it back. Lift it up and repeat again. Xing Shuring Shine, the water slowly dripped from the whetstone and the blade, falling to the ground in delicate droplets. A subtle but fiendish aura began to grow around Lionel's spear. Steam began to rise up from its blade edges. Every time the sound of the blade resounded, the steam only seemed to become denser. How many is that? The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. A ranker spoke softly, his gaze having already narrowed. His leisurely attitude vanished and his sword appeared in his hand. Despite the fact he was ranker 83, he still primed himself to the extreme. There was only one technique of the Luxniks that could brew this sort of atmosphere. It was a technique that used the star force characteristics of snow force to refine and strengthen a blade force. The continuous and abrasive sliding of force against force forced them to shine brighter and sharper. And the result? It was a weapon force several times purer and more powerful than it was initially. 6 refinements. Another ranker answered slowly. In the moment Lionel swung his blade, it was as though there was only him and his spear left in this world. The sound of the rustling leaves vanished, the battlefield turned wonderland lost its splendor, it was even difficult to feel the heat coming off of Lionel any longer. The blade shot out in a blinding light of white, gold and silver. If one looked closely, there was just the slightest hint of crimson as well, belying an aura of pervasive destruction that shook the soul and imprinted itself onto the heart. In that moment, the rankers realized that they were completely in over their heads. Just this single blade seemed to overshadow their decades of hard work, all the efforts of their blood, sweat and tears. It was all meaningless. The group that had been targeted was one of 3. Each of their expressions warped to an extreme, their force surging. Without hesitation, all 3 leapt forward in unison, realizing that if they didn't work together, they would be finished. Their 3 swords drew a line through the air, meeting at a single point. However, the instant their blades matches just the blade force of Lionel's own, it felt as though they had been swallowed up by an unstoppable force. Visit for the best no_underscore experience. Their arms broke and their expressions became dyed with pain. Blood vessels in their eyes popped and their teeth cracked beneath the might of their clenched jaws. They put everything they had forward, knowing that if they took even a single step back they would die here. The difference was too large. Unfortunately, understanding something and executing it was separated by an impossibly vast chasm. Bang! Sparkling shards of natural spear force spiraled into the surroundings. Deep gouges tore through the earth and surrounding foliage and trees. In the distance, the windows of several pristine and unblemished buildings and homes shattered to pieces, piling onto the growing chaos of the Luxnix family estate. It felt as though they had all stepped into a violent spatial storm, swaying under the whims of deep space. When the battlefield finally cleared, the three youths who had faced the spear force together landed on the ground, their breathing heavy and hurried. All across their bodies, deep gashes of bloodied wounds even down to the bone could be seen. Before them, a young man who could be considered their savior stood. His torso was bare and there was the slight sheen of sweat from an earlier practice session still on his body. Yet, his vitality seemed to be brimming and his gaze was sharp. Arm head. The excitement of both the fallen and spectating members of the healing arm were practically palpable. The hidden and observing members of the other arms raised an eyebrow, feeling that this matter was becoming more and more unpredictable. Visit. For the best no_vil_undershinji experience, Elodie looked around at the state of the battlefield, a strong shield of force skin protecting him from the effects of Lionel's Four Seasons realm. His brow furrowed in confusion, a clear lack of understanding painted all over his features. Elodie's long white hair danced within the wind, his gaze finally landing on Lionel. Who are you? Which arm are you from? Elodie immediately began to question Lionel. Elodie could still feel his wrist trembling from Lionel's strike, but the issue was that none of the arm heads wielded a spear. Even that man who had the favor of all the Star Order elders also wielded a sword. He didn't know of anyone who wore silver armor and used a polearm. But he could also feel the pure snow force coming from Lionel that made it absolutely certain that he was a member of the Luxnix. Arm? He is a branch family member? Theron coughed violently. He had been carried away from the battlefield under the help of several individuals, but both of his arms were still glaringly missing. Though he was far luckier than Becca. Due to the fact he had lost his arm to a blade, reconnecting them wouldn't be impossible for their healing arm. Theron's words, though, were like a bomb being thrown amidst the battlefield. It wasn't just the other division heads and unranked disciples that were shocked, but the rankers and even Elodie himself took on a great amount of shock. Elodie's gaze narrowed. State your name and which branch you come from. Do you have any idea the kind of harm you'll be bringing to your immediate family? The only response Elodie received was the sound of a sharpening war blade. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Sheing. Chapter 1131. Elodie's pupils constricted, his sword reflexively coming across his body to block. Bang. Elodie felt a strong surge of might intent on sending him flying, but his gaze flashed, his feet digging two deep trenches as he slid back. Dirt and soil rose from the ground, slowing Elodie's momentum by several factors. When he finally came to a stop, Elodie couldn't help but look down at his trembling hands, his face etched with a deep frown. The heaviness of Lionel's attacks wasn't something he had expected. Not only was the spear a rare weapon for a Luxnix to choose, even in the case that it was chosen, those that did would focus on the speed and flexibility of it, not to mention its range. Elodie hadn't expected for Lionel's battle style to be like this. But that didn't mean that he was completely unprepared for battle either. Whether it was the Viola family or the Montex family especially, they were known for their heavy-handedness and their abrasive battle styles. As a great genius of his generation, Elodie had clashed with his fair share of such talents. In fact, his techniques were refined to deal with them. The moment Elodie adjusted his thoughts and breathing, his whole demeanor shifted. This was not a spar, nor was it a healthy exchange of pointers. This person was an enemy and he would treat him as such. Elodie completed his thoughts in just the fraction of a breath. His sword balanced itself with a practiced flick of his wrist and his feet spread apart, creating a strong base for himself. The instant he was steady, his figure exploded forth, and yet the ground suffered not the slightest of damage. Lionel seemed to have acted before Elodie, but the difference in the weight and size of their weapons resulted in their blades meeting perfectly. Elodie could tell immediately that Lionel had done this on purpose, but he wasn't shocked. If Lionel wasn't at least this skilled, things wouldn't have reached this extent to begin with. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Elodie's body flickered and his sword left streaks of white gold in the air. For every one action Lionel took, he took 3 or 4, the elegance of his swordplay shining forth. His rhythm changed with his breath and his footwork was immaculate. He seemed to always be capable of slipping out of Lionel's heaviest strikes and countering with something decidedly clever and crafty. The clash of blades rang through the battlefield, the images of two young men flickering into and out of existence being imprinted onto all their minds. It was clear at a glance that Elodie's blade force was far inferior to Lionel's own. One had already comprehended a natural blade force while the other was still using normal blade force. However, on the other hand, Elodie's fifth-dimensional force was clearly several steps above Lionel's in terms of thickness and purity, given due to the fact Elodie was already at Tier 8 while Lionel was only at Tier 2. Streaks of spear and sword force shot into the surroundings with each clash. There was something decidedly violent and existential about the clash of these two young men. Neither used any techniques that surpassed the crude nature of force alone, and yet every time they met the impact was no less resounding. Elodie had long since forgotten about what Lionel's origins were, and Lionel never cared about Elodie's to begin with. Their exchanges only became faster and more blinding, neither taking a single step back. Veins popped across Elodie's body, his spirit lifting and his gaze becoming fierce. Visit. For a better user experience, the ground beneath Elodie's feet imploded, a towering pillar of snow force shooting up into the skies around him. His sword descended, the clash against Lionel's spear making the latter feel as though it wasn't a light sword before him, but rather a great sword with the weight of a mountain. It shattered Lionel's guard, shooting for his chest with every intention of piercing through, but Lionel's own gaze was as placid as a lake's surface beneath dim moonlight. The piercing strike of Elodie's blade suddenly lost its edge. With a clang, it rebounded off of Lionel's chest plate, deflecting to the side. Lionel took a step forward, taking advantage of Elodie's momentum to send a punch toward his chest. Elodie reacted just as indifferently, his own fist soaring forward like a whistling bullet. The air cracked and whined, the ground beneath their feet trembling. Bang! The two separated, sliding back dozens of meters and creating a total of 4 new trenches between them. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel didn't need to think to understand how Elodie had gone from using his speed to match his strength to matching strength on strength. Was a technique similar to Lionel's own. It used the healing branch properties of snow force to push the body into a state of accelerated cell regeneration. Using that window, the Luxnix could gain bestial strength in exchange for continuous and rapidly healing injuries. As expected of the head of the healing branch, Elodie's hair rose up, billowing white gold force wafting outward like plumes of steam in heavy fog. His hair and eyes became a shade brighter, and the fiendish killing intent in his eyes only grew. The sound of Elodie's force was like the howling wind of a storm, whipping up violent undercurrents and flattening what remained of the grass in the surroundings. Show me everything you have. If today is to be the anniversary of your death, you wouldn't want to pass on with regrets. Elodie's aura continued to surge. In that moment, the flickering starlights of the heavenly body realm began to rise. Images of a beautiful golden planet, streaking white gold meteors, a silvery moon formed of shimmering gems and a resplendent star painted themselves across the grayish-blue skies. Elodie's sword seemed to respond in kind, trembling and whistling under the influx of universal force. Then he shot forward, his steps decidedly less light. Plumes of soil rose in his wake, his sword appearing before Lionel's throat in the blink of an eye. However, when it reached that point, it found its force dissipating once more, only to find a pale violet in its path. The latest _sodies are on the website. Chapter 1132. Elodie's expression changed when he felt his sword pierced through it made him feel as though he was trying to slice through a wall of sludge, and his reaction to it was forced to be delayed. Once against, Elodie felt like all the force in his strike was dissipated. The first time he had assumed that it was an ability of Lionel's armor, but this time his sword hadn't even grazed it. It suddenly made him understand that Lionel was forcefully dispersing the force attached to his blade, something that left him at a shock. The combination of dream rupture, duality domain, withering snowfall and Lionel's divine armor's spatial domain made Elodie feel as though all his most powerful strikes were landing on a bed of cotton. Lionel had too many abilities that could siphon away and disperse force. It forced Elodie into using more and more force to compensate, but that only drained his stamina faster. The instant Elodie turned this into a battle of techniques, he found himself countered at every turn. He could feel that his actual strength wasn't far off from Lionel. In fact, in terms of raw ability, he was a step or two above. But Lionel's ability to calculate a step or two ahead of him and respond perfectly resulted in him getting pushed further and further into a corner. Bang, 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 bang. Elodie brandished his sword in one hand, his other drawing a circle in the air. A ring of blinding white gold formed in the blink of an eye as he parried Lionel's piercing spear strike. The ring of white gold shot downward, landing perfectly in the spot Lionel's foot would land next. Elodie's timing was perfect. Everything about Lionel's momentum said that he wouldn't be able to dodge in time. However, the land in the middle of the ring suddenly shot upward, giving Lionel a place to rest his foot. Elodie's free hand squeezed closed, shattering the small pillar of earth, but completely missing the target of Lionel's ankle. Right then, a blinding pair of wings stretching out for tens of meters spread to Lionel's back. Lionel knew that he couldn't allow his foot to fall to the ground, and could only activate his strongest movement technique. His body became as light as a feather, circulating instantaneously. With a light tap of his foot toward the crumbling rock pillar, Lionel vanished and appeared to Elodie's back. The shock amongst the spectators was palpable. Even as the crowd grew, drawn over by both the commotion and Lionel's earlier beam of light, there were likewise several members of the Speed Arm who were amongst them. However, even in the case that there wasn't a single member of the Luxnick's main family that wouldn't recognize those illusory wings. Visit. For a better user experience, Elodie's pupils constricted into pinholes. He could feel the threat of danger creeping upon his neck, but he reacted just as quickly. A white gold ring shot out from the ground, catching Lionel somewhat off guard. At the same time, Elodie's sword pierced backward, his body twisting at an odd angle as he fell away from Lionel. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Elodie's white gold ring was too solid and simple to find a flaw, and dispersing the force that made it would take too much time. He finished these calculations in an instant, choosing to swing his spear downward. At the same time, another appeared before him, blocking the odd angle of Elodie's sword. Frustration began to mar Elodie's brow. He once again felt as though his sword had entered a sticky mud wall. Luckily he was falling back now and could use his momentum to pull free, but this was already the fourth or fifth time. Elodie shot back, his body flipping and dodging as numerous golden droplets fell toward him like darts. His free hand remained active, drawing more and more white gold rings as he fell backward, only to send them flying forward toward Lionel. Bang! Lionel's spear shattered the white gold ring, his expression just as placid as always. Seeing the flood of them coming for him, his gaze flickered, the unmoving 9 radiant cores to his back jumping into action. A strong magnetic field repelled the rings, sending them spiraling backward as Lionel's figure flickered once more. Elodie's internal sight locked onto Lionel, who appeared to his back, but his heart shook in the next instant. Illusion. Elodie had fought too many battles with Eloquent to not sense the change. Surprisingly though, Lionel's was even better than Eloquent's. Who was this man? Elodie's slightly delayed reaction didn't stop him from reacting in time. The billowing white gold fog around him surged, his thigh bulging as he planted it hard. He could feel the muscles in his legs tearing to shreds beneath the wild force, but just as quickly as they tore, they healed once more. Visit. For a better user experience using the sudden change in momentum, his sword pierced forward, his rings rebounding back from Lionel's repulsion and enveloping his 9 radiant cores. In one moment, it looked as though Elodie was piercing toward empty space. In the next, a flicker of starlight formed the outline of Lionel's body as the image to Elodie's back vanished into nothingness. Lionel's spear met Elodie's blade even as the former's radiant cores and the latter's ring clashed. Crush them. Elodie's gaze gave off a blinding light. His rings constricted, looking to shatter Lionel's radiant cores back into the benign force they came from. However, the result was far more explosive than he thought they would be. Boom. 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 Elodie felt as though his ears had popped as his eyes were filled with the searing image of blinding white lights. The only thing he could feel was the very familiar and annoying feeling of his sword slipping into a mud wall. But this time when he tried to pull back, his expression warped. Snap. Even amid all the loud cacophonic booms as a swordsman, this noise was the most resounding of all. Even before he pulled back all the way, Elodie could feel the emptiness past the handle of his hilt. His sword was broken? In that moment, Elodie was completely disoriented. His hearing was nothing but high-pitched screeches, his gaze was filled with a blinding white light, and his internal sight was continuously being distorted by the wild magnetic fields pulsing and rebounding in the surroundings. The heat seared through his foreskin and his body felt like it was floating toward death. It was exactly at that moment that he felt the second clear feeling he had since the explosion. A piercing pain as his chest was skewered by the blade of a spear. Elodie coughed, a flood of blood riding down his chin and soaking his throat and chest. He had no idea how any of this had happened, but he vaguely felt that he had been painted into this corner. No, he had stepped into this trap with his arms wide open. Visit. For a better user experience, if Elodie had known better, he would have understood that the law Lionel chose for his S was the formation of an extremely thick and viscous corrosive semi-liquid. The more knowledge Lionel had on the law he chose, the easier it would be for him to use his king's might to project the law. With his ability, it took him a single glance to see through the flaws and craftsmanship Elodie's Tier 9 bronze sword had, and forcing it to collapse in on itself only took a few dips. Of course, understanding this would have done nothing for Elodie if he hadn't also understood that destroying Lionel's radiant cores was among the most foolish things he could have done. Elodie trembled and fell to his knees. The blasts cleared and the spectators were soon able to see the state of the battlefield. However, when they saw their arm-head having fallen, and that the only thing holding him up was the blade running through his chest, they fell into a harsh and cold silence. Seeing the state of Elodie, Lionel didn't feel much of anything. No, that wasn't exactly right. He felt an emptiness wrought by the fact he felt like he had accomplished nothing. A seething rage was still bubbling within his heart and pulsing through his right hip. His wrist slightly trembled, causing Elodie to cough up another mouthful of blood. What is the meaning of this? Right at that moment, while Lionel's simmering rage was beginning to feel only more and more empty, a booming voice that could disperse the clouds and unsettle the wind fell. Numerous expressions changed as the aura of the current Luxnix family patriarch, Seath, caught all of their attention. To his back, numerous Viola family members followed. Lionel felt like he had locked onto a new target, his blood seething and the crimson in his eyes only growing deeper and more prominent. But it was then that he felt as though someone had pierced a hole through his heart. Everything he was feeling suddenly deflated in an instant. And a resounding crack rang through Lionel's body. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Completely out of his control, he raised his head and roared into the skies, his divine armor shattering into pieces and shooting away from his body. His face was revealed to the world, but all anyone could see were the countless crimson veins pulsing beneath his skin. The barrier to Tier 3 collapsed and Lionel's 7-star began to form. Chapter 1133. A blazing pillar of fire left Lionel's lips. To those of the Luxnix, it really felt as though the world might end at any time. Elodie, who was the closest to Lionel by far, took on a level of damage that could only be described as fatal. An entire layer of skin that faced Lionel burned off piece by piece, the shocking amount of pain snapping him out of his half-unconscious state. The devastation was difficult to grasp. Even Lionel's duality spear couldn't seem to withstand it at all. Seath's expression changed. He had no idea who Lionel was. Or more accurately, he couldn't identify Lionel by his face alone. But, when he saw what was happening, even his own spine tingled. He was already well into the 6th dimension and someone on Lionel's level should have been a matter of the flex of a single finger to deal with, but the force being projected out of his body right now filled Seath with so much fear that he froze for several seconds, his mind going completely blank. Under normal circumstances, Seath wouldn't even be here. It was only because Richard had come to communicate something with him that he had gone so far. Because Richard was now the crown heir of the Viola family, something only recently announced, there was an amount of face that Seath had to give him. In other families, Richard would have been entertained by their own crown heir, but unfortunately for Seath, the situation of the Luxnix was a bit unique. In every other situation, the patriarch had higher standing than the crown heir. But, in the Luxnix, it was the opposite. Miguel's standing was far beyond Seath's and the former had the backing of both the Feathersword Warriors and the Star Order Council. In the end, such a perfunctory job was left up to Seath. Visit. For a better user experience, when Seath snapped out of it, he realized just how terrible the situation was and immediately began giving out orders. Corner off this location. Don't allow anyone to enter this kilometer radius. Someone give me a briefing of what the hell happened right now. The moment after Seath said these words, he shot forward. He only had one goal in mind, to save Elodie. Because of the oddity of this generation, Elodie, Eloquent and Siller were an important balancing factor. Without them, Miguel's influence on this generation would be too strong. Though it was a bit naive of Seath to believe that just these three could match up to Miguel, he had no choice but to play the long game. The loss of even one of them would be far too much. He couldn't allow Elodie to die. Even if he didn't have such political implications to his thoughts, the Luxnix family couldn't just allow a genius to die for no reason. Seath didn't hold back, displaying the strength of a genius of the last generation. He used the six-dimensional movement techniques of the Luxnix with such skill that he managed to cover a kilometer distance in what felt like the blink of an eye. Visit. For the best no_vil_underscored_ng experience, his foreskin began to melt away piece by piece, withering away under the wall of heat emitting from Lionel. His expression couldn't help but change. He could tell that Lionel was just tier 3 of the 5th dimension. How could a youth so far beneath him possibly corrode his foreskin? A murderous glint lit in Seath's gaze. He didn't know exactly what had happened here, but he didn't recognize Lionel, and just by his tan skin and hair color, he shouldn't be a member of the main branch. If Lionel could be controlled, it would be a boon for the Luxnix. But, seeing the carnage he caused here, how could things be so easy? Seath had every intention of killing Lionel where he stood until he felt something lock onto him. The danger was so profound that his steps almost faltered. The danger he felt from Lionel was more innate and instinctual, almost like what a child would feel toward the dark. But, it was still easy enough for one with a strong mind like Seath to bury this feeling and eventually get over it. But, this danger was completely different. It wasn't an irrational or instinctual fear, it was the kind of fear one felt when they ran into something they knew they couldn't overcome, the kind of fear that had to be learned through years of experience and training. The latest _AP_SODs are on _the website. Cold sweat drenched Seath from head to toe. He had no idea who was protecting Lionel in the shadows, but this experience was all he needed to know to understand just how vast the difference between them was. Seath appeared to Elodie's side. By now, the latter's face had practically entirely melted, his features becoming impossible to distinguish and pick out. If things continued, he really would have no chance or hope at surviving. Without hesitation, Seath pulled him away and charged out in a beam of light, cutting a straight path away from Lionel as fast as he could. The beam of fire emitting from Lionel only grew fiercer, his roar underlying it and trembling the hearts of all those who heard it. The clouds above completely dispersed and the ground shattered, large amounts of rocks beginning to melt and pool themselves into a larger and larger crater of lava. Waves of heat rippled into the surroundings. By the time Seath got back to where he had been, he realized that even without his orders, no one would have dared to enter the kilometer-wide radius. The heat was simply overwhelming, and even from so far away, many were still continuously moving back. The only ones that couldn't were the few stuck within Lionel's 4 pillars. Visit. For the best no_ng experience crack. The duality spear finally couldn't take it any longer and completely collapsed, combusting from the inside out. Its pieces flew out in all directions, some even piercing directly into Lionel's body, and yet he seemed so numb to it all that he didn't even notice. Chapter 1134. Lionel's body looked as though it might crack itself. Wild and raging red veins pulsed beneath his skin as his bones seemed to glow as though they were metals rising in temperature. Upon his chest, every beat of his heart was met by a pulse of red gold. It looked as though even his heart itself was overheating, filling up with lines of fire and magma. But there was no more prominent light than the one coming from his right hip. Surging tides of force rippled out again and again, the devastation only growing fiercer. The truth was that Lionel was a bit worried about things happening like this. But he had never expected to enter Tier 3 so quickly. By his previous progress, it should have taken over a year at the very least. However, Lionel could have never imagined just the kind of impact would have on his progress, especially when combined with the secrets of his innate force node. When Lionel first learned he had an innate force node, he had randomly stumbled onto it. According to his calculations he completed, his body would only be perfectly whole if he completed a 10th node, despite the fact the cap the universe placed on everyone was 9. Being foolish and naive, Lionel went ahead and tried to form a 10th anyway, not having any idea that he would almost get himself killed. If not for the preparations his father had made and the plentiful nutrients hidden within his body from all of those vomit smoothies he was forced to chug, Lionel would have never made it so far in his journey. Visit. For a better user experience back then, Lionel had been all alone on terrain and could only ask the dictionary about his innate node. The trouble was that the dictionary had always been extremely specific with its answers. It never answered anything outside the scope of the questions Lionel posed to it, no matter how useful those answers would be. Lionel had asked the dictionary a very simple question. What abilities is Scarlet Star Force known for? and the dictionary had given him a very simple one-word answer: destruction. Soon after that, Lionel realized that there was someone driving a carriage over his hiding spot, and he was forced to go out and check on what was happening. But, even if he hadn't been distracted, he could have never known just what kind of profound truths were hidden within this answer. Lionel had learned a lot about artistic conception and how they could breathe life into techniques and bolster one's strength. One of the most powerful abilities a person could have, the universal cycles, relied on a comprehension of artistic conception to draw in universal force to supplement your strength. Visit. For a better user experience. Ultimately, the artistic conception that the universal cycles were embodying was exactly that: the power of cycles and beauty of the dimensional versus karma. One thing would lead to the next, and a perpetual cyclical construct could be formed. In the end, these cycles would give birth to universal force, one of the highest forms of force in all of existence and among one of the most enigmatic. How exactly did all of this relate to Scarlet Star Force? Well, it too represented a high form of energy. In fact, at least in human history, the importance of fire and the symbolism it carried was undeniable. Among all the elements, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that fire stood out amongst the rest. Through the lens of the human domain, there was no denying this. When things are put into this sort of perspective, just what sort of weight did the first-ranked fire elemental force hold? Destruction. Ironically, it was the antithesis of what human legends painted it out to be. So many painted it out to be a harbinger of life, a candle of innovation, a breath to a refreshing future. But Scarlet Star Force was anything but this. It was a force that embodied chaos, an elemental power that would burn all things to ash. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the fifth dimension was all about loosening the shackles the mind had on the body. In order to do this, techniques relied on visualization techniques to allow one to shed the mundane limits one subconsciously placed on themselves. Whether it was King's Might, and their fusion into the manifestation of Lionel's innate node, all of them were aspects of Lionel's consciousness. By choosing himself as the root artistic conception of his, Lionel had inadvertently added an indelible characteristic of destruction to his King's Might. In the vice versa, the implementation of Lionel's King's Might to project the will of his innate node had resulted in him subconsciously beginning to comprehend this Scarlet Star Force which took his body on as a host. The result of these series of events were the preconceptions and misunderstandings in Lionel's mind being cleared one after another. The more he began to embody his true abilities and his true talents, the looser the chains that bound him became. At the same time, Lionel had no idea how lucky he was for two reasons in specific. First, if Lionel had completed this breakthrough on a fifth-dimensional world, not only he but everyone on the planet would have died. Scarlet Star Force was something that even Seath, a Tier 7 sixth-dimensional expert, couldn't reliably counter for an extended period of time. How could a fifth-dimensional world possibly stand a chance? And second, had Lionel used the visualization to reach Tier 3 instead of relying on his comprehension of his innate node to release the shackles on himself instead? The latest _IP_SODs are on the website. There was a 0% probability that he would have survived the formation of his 7th star. Without first grasping the artistic conception of destruction, how could his body, which couldn't even survive a split-second usage of Scarlet Star Force, possibly survive the formation of an entire star? No. Lionel had a 10% probability of surviving. Chapter 1135. That's. Savon and Yuri looked toward one another, then toward Aina's back. But ever since they had come here, Aina hadn't said a word. In truth, this was a bit odd for her current self. She had become very talkative after losing her personality, mostly because she didn't know the difference between thinking her thoughts and saying them out loud, so she just ended up saying whatever it was that was on her mind. However, it had already been several minutes since they reached this scene, but she hadn't commented on anything. When Savon and Yuri took a peek at her face, they once again found nothing. She stared toward the man roaring into the skies without even the slightest twinkle in her eye. If it were to be described, it was almost like she was sleeping or dreaming with her eyes open. The pair of girls looked toward one another again, but they were at a loss for what to say. They had already gotten used to one form of Aina's slow recovery, but this was completely new territory for them. This could get complicated. The two felt a flicker of complex emotions, their tiny fists tightening. They didn't know how these matters would end, but wasn't this the absolute worst time for Lionel to appear? And even under these circumstances, this Richard mumbled something beneath his breath, his expression changing several times. He, of course, recognized Lionel. In fact, unlike the others, he was actually quite used to seeing force wildly fluctuating around him like this. He might have had a harder time if Lionel was in his normal state, ironically enough. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. HM? Is something the matter? Seath, who had been tending to Elodie before passing him on to others, frowned when he heard Richard. It would have been one thing if Richard was just reacting to the ridiculous nature of the situation, but Seath was far sharper than a fifth-dimensional boy would be. He could see a hint of recognition in Richard's eye. Do you know this boy? Seath pressed. Richard shook his head internally. He had gotten careless after so many years of vying for the crown heir position. He had been strung up so tight over the last several decades that the moment he got a chance to relax he became too loose. To think he would make such a rudimentary mistake. Yes, I do, Richard replied. He knew that it was a fool's errand to lie to a sixth-dimensional expert, especially when that expert was a Luxnix. Their internal sight was too strong and they were too good at picking up small little details. This was only more so for a patriarch like Seath who was embroiled in political games all day. Might I ask the young crown heir from where? Seath was greatly curious about this. He didn't expect that Richard would be familiar with Lionel. Of course, Richard had expected this much. The moment he made the mistake he knew he would have to tell the entire story. Seath had just done him a great favor by accepting his proposal, so he couldn't just withhold such benign information from him. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_G experience plus, Richard no longer had to keep the matters related to a secret since he had already secured his position. It was just a bit embarrassing. But then again, considering the state of Elodie, the embarrassment of Richard's loss was actually mitigated greatly. Savon and Yuri couldn't help but perk their ears up. They also found it hard to believe that Lionel would know Richard. The difference between their statuses should have been enormous. He was even a step above the arm heads of the Luxnix and technically on par with Miguel. Though, in practice, he was more so on par with the arm heads and dwarfed by Miguel. Yes. I met him in the dimensional cleanse trial zone. Seath's pupils constricted. He didn't need any more of an explanation. From Richard's tone and demeanor, it was clear he had lost. But, how could a branch family member possibly get their hands on a map to that trial zone? Seath suddenly felt like something was off about all of this. He had even noticed that Lionel had been wielding a high-quality quasi-silver spear before it was destroyed. This didn't even mention the fact he had practically wiped out half of the healing arm and even defeated Elodie. All of these things made it hard to reconcile these matters. In that moment, the situation suddenly changed. Lionel hacked up a mouthful of blood so crimson that it glowed like rubies. It almost felt as though this blood had come from the spring of his life force itself. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was burnt to ash. Not even a moment later, Lionel's skin could no longer withstand the pressure. His veins burst and his body splintering. Fountains of lava-like blood flowed from him. Under the astonished gazes of those watching, Lionel's blood began to sizzle as it fell into the pools of lava around his feet. But what was shocking was that it wasn't the lava causing the blood to sizzle and evaporate, it was instead Lionel's blood itself causing the lava to release screeching pillars of steam. Visit. For the best no_G experience, the roaring pillar of flames that came from Lionel's mouth hung in the air, his roar finally waning. But it was impossible to tell if this was because he was no longer in pain, or if it was just that his throat couldn't produce noise any longer. Steam billowed out from Lionel's mouth, his teeth glistening a pearly white beneath all the blood and fire. Sparks flew about with his every breath as though the air itself would ignite. Out of Lionel's control, two enormous illusory wings appeared to his back. They radiated a gorgeous white gold, and slowly but surely, they began to take form, just the slightest hint of crimson hidden within its gorgeously sculpted feathers. Lionel's head fell, going from tilted up to the skies to his chin resting on his chest. If not for the slight wheezing and coughing, not to mention the breaths of ash, it would be impossible to tell if he was still alive or not. It was then that his skin began to change once more. Scales of white gold erupted across his naked body. From far away they seemed to be the scales of a white dragon. But when one looked closer, it was possible to see that each individual scale was actually a small miniaturized feather, outlined like a white seashell with veins of gold. Lionel had completed the second awakening of the healing branch and the third of the speed branch at the very same time. Every so often, a piece of his body would burst with blood, only to be quickly covered by these white scales once more. The cycle repeated again and again as though he was breathing. Glistening lava fell from his wings as his feet dangled in the skies. His body, toned to perfection, every outline of muscle and fiber displayed for all to see, didn't seem marred by the broken flesh and dripping blood in the slightest. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersng experience at that moment, he truly looked like a fallen angel. Chapter 1136. Lionel could feel his body going through a wild number of changes. He felt it all now more than he ever had in the past, and he realized just how narrow his scope truly was. It wasn't that the snowy star owl lineage factor was weak, it was just that he never had the ability to bring out its full potential. First, he was lacking in the proper techniques to supplement it, and second, he had simply yet to fully unearth all of its secrets and fully awaken it all. This was when Lionel settled on a conclusion. The reason his metal synergy lineage factor felt so much more powerful was only a matter of relativity. How could a sixth-dimensional lineage factor ever match up to a seventh-dimensional one, especially when they could both be considered to be at the pinnacle of their respective levels? Simply put, maybe if Lionel entered the sixth dimension and began to interact with many talents on a similar level to himself, he would then begin to feel that even the Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor was weak as well, when in reality he was also lacking the techniques to maximize its abilities. Right now, the potential Lionel had unearthed from his metal synergy lineage factor was limited to a hard body. But technically was a technique left behind to him by his father. Aside from that, there was his divine armor. But once again, that was a technique left behind to him by his father. It was such a simple thing, but Lionel hadn't truly put things into perspective until just now. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. The Morales family lineage factor was called metal synergy. It wasn't called metal body lineage factor or divine armor lineage factor. Who knew how many more secrets were hidden within it that Lionel had never even touched upon? These matters put into perspective just how ridiculous Lionel was to think that he needed to improve his snowy star owl lineage factor right now, as though he was already at the end of his rope. Let alone being at the end of it. Lionel could just barely be considered to have grasped a piece of the first strands. Even if Lionel succeeded in mutating his snowy star owl lineage factor and built it upon a new force, it was very possible that even if this force was leagues beyond snow force, the overall power of his lineage factor might instead regress. Why? Because this new mutated lineage factor wouldn't have the countless millennia of refined techniques the Luxniks had built over their history. It would have to rely on Lionel to rebuild and modify it all from the ground up. It was possible that Lionel could be capable of this in the future. But as things stood now, even with all his split minds, he was still lacking. As more of Lionel's potential was dug out by his evolving snowy star owl lineage factor, Lionel could feel more and more of its strength. Visit. For the best no_vil_undersng experience, the second awakening of the healing branch felt like a perpetual technique. Without allowing these feather-like scales to cover his body, Lionel's base healing factor had skyrocketed by more than tenfold. To put this into perspective, the base form of the mage art Lionel had self-created was only marginally better than Lionel's current base healing factor. Meaning, doing nothing was almost as good as casting, except it would cost Lionel almost no stamina at all, not to mention the fact it didn't require a cast time. If Lionel activated these feather-like scales and entered this sort of beast-like mode, his healing factor would increase several-fold more. By then, it would be a step better than casting the full mage art. As though this wasn't enough, Lionel felt that upon reaching this second awakening, his had evolved as well. In the past, it took several months for one use to recover. This time period varied so much that Lionel couldn't put a sure number on it. This was because in order to use, a certain amount of snow force had been absorbed and stored for a single burst use. But, as a baseline comparison, while on planet Luxnix, likely the densest region of snow force in this sector, it would take Lionel about 3 months to recover a single use of. Now, in this same environment, Lionel could feel that he only needed a single month to replenish his use of. In fact, Lionel had yet to recover from his last use, but the instant he completed his second awakening, it had been replenished. The latest _IP_SODIs are on _the website. Then there was Lionel stepping into the third awakening of the Snowy Star Owl speed branch. In truth, Lionel rarely used his speed branch in battle. The reason for this was quite simple. As calculative and scheming as he was, he wouldn't show an enemy his full abilities until he could force them into a corner with it. Speed was one of the largest factors in battle. In fact, Lionel felt that maybe the one thing no amount of calculation could overcome was indomitable speed. In addition, varying your attack speed made you a much more difficult opponent to handle than going full tilt from the very beginning. Lionel's slow, meticulous and trap-setting approach to battle always left his speed branch by the wayside, but it had ironically been the first to reach its third awakening anyway. This was only a matter of fate. It had to be remembered that the snowy star owl was first and foremost known for its speed and wisdom. Healing was considered to be a secondary ability of its. Because the lineage factor was built on the back of snow force affinity, Lionel had a major leg up on the others of the Luxniks. Why was it that his snowy star owl lineage factor was leaps and bounds beyond the others? The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. The simple answer was that Lionel's light and star affinities were so high that snow force simply awakened to him naturally. In the end, it all linked back to the very same innate node that called his kidney home. Chapter 1137. Truthfully, all of these thoughts were simply running in the back of Lionel's mind. After two subsequent breakthroughs of the mind, Lionel's ability to split his attention had bloomed from just over a 1,010,000 to a number approaching 5 million. Such a thing could only be said to be both a blessing and a curse. When he was battling, bathing in blood, bone and limbs, his mind was quite blank. All he cared about was calculating his next attack and making those before him suffer as much as possible. Rage colored his thoughts and took hold of his heart. There was only it and everything else was a sheet of white. But, when he saw her gaze, it felt like years of buried thoughts and feelings had all resurfaced at once. Something within him snapped and whatever had been leashed within him was released, ravaging his body like a wild beast. He could still see that gaze now. In fact, he could piece everything that made it up. No matter how much he tried to distract himself with just how much was going on in his body now, no matter how much he tried to focus on something else, to put his mind to something else, nothing worked. He could feel her gaze almost as though he was still looking into it. A hint of recognition, an odd curiosity, and then nothing. Her gaze didn't have any sadness, no remorse, no happiness, no glee. It was as though she was looking at the face of an acquaintance she had known long ago, a classmate that she remembered the look of and was mildly curious about just what they might be doing here. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel wished he didn't have the ability to analyze everything so thoroughly. He wished that he could believe that it was nonsense and that he had seen wrong, that his memory was fallible and maybe his brain was playing a trick on him, forcing him to see the worst. But he knew that none of this true. As many minds as he had turned toward focusing on his body, he still had too many more left over. Each of them picking apart every angle, every expression, every minute detail. Let alone just her gaze, he could measure out the beat of her heart, the perspiration of her skin, the slant of her lips, the wrinkle of her nose. He could see the shift in her body, the angle of her arms, the position of her feet, the state of her hands. In just a split moment he had gained hundreds of snapshots of each. Her posture was too unmoved, her breathing too even, her heart too steady. Her hands didn't clench, her gaze didn't tremble, and her feet didn't shift. Worst of all, her lips were just fine. How many times had he warned her not to bite those soft, pink lips of hers? And how many times had she ignored him? It was a habit she had built up over so many years. So long as she was biting them, Lionel was certain that something was wrong and he would have traveled through the gates of hell to make sure that she was okay. There was none of the characteristics of Aina he had come to know. The latest _IP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel didn't feel rage or anger. He just felt that the abyss that had been forming his gaze was now in his heart. It was a depth of emptiness he had never felt before, a level of nihilism he had never faced before. He had thought a lot about how this meeting after so long would go, but this was the last thing he had expected. Even indifference wasn't as bad as this. Maybe if she had been indifferent, then he could have concluded that she was still mad. But this wasn't that. Lionel's body descended into the pool of lava beneath him. The searing heat was practically like cool waters to his skin. It glided off of him and even his wounds without a sound as his swim pair of wings retracted in a flutter of falling feathers. 2 white gold rune marks appeared upon Lionel's back before slowly fading. An eerie sort of silence fell over everything, no one quite sure of what to do. Seath was especially indecisive. He was the only one that had felt that aura from earlier. There was nothing that had changed between then and now. He didn't believe that this hidden individual would suddenly allow him to kill Lionel now that his breakthrough was practically finished. Feathers of white gold began to fall from the skies. There wasn't a single Luxnix family member that didn't recognize this phenomenon. Though it was extraordinarily rare amongst fifth-dimensional existences, to the point where only two could do it, Elodie and Miguel, the same couldn't be said for the sixth-dimensional members of the Luxnix family. So, this was a sight that many had seen before or at least heard about. Visit. For the best no-understanding experience, it suddenly dawned on them all that Lionel was a master of several branches, something that made them all numb with shock. From the start of the phenomenon to the end, Lionel didn't move, his head still angled somewhat downward. It felt almost as though he was in his own world and couldn't be bothered with everything around him. This place. He didn't want to be here anymore. Lionel slowly stepped out the pool of lava, walking up the slope, apparently not aware of just how naked he was. He thought it was a shame that his duality spear was destroyed. It was probably the most useful and appropriate for his battle style among the quasi-silver spears. Though the spear domain ring was able to repair spears, this was clearly beyond its limits. There wasn't even a single piece left. Luckily, Lionel's divine armor was a symbiotic part of him. After using it was already in perfect shape. The sadness and relief of these two matters didn't seem to move the needle for Lionel one way or another. Without a care for those around him, he simply walked toward the 4 pillars. Seath frowned. He didn't know what those pillars were, but he knew that if he allowed Lionel to walk into them, he would be gone. But what could he possibly do? Were things really going to end like this? Visit. For the best no_undersang experience. More coming. Chapter 1138. Yuri and Savon looked toward one another, their expressions too complex to read. As surprised as everyone else was that Lionel was simply walking away, they were maybe even more so. Lionel was difficult to read. Despite the whirlwind of emotions going on his mind and heart, his face gave nothing away. The only hint of something was that his gaze was decidedly less cold. But even this was only something they had gotten a brief look at when Lionel's gaze met Ana's. However, what neither of them expected was that Lionel would turn and leave without even trying to say anything to her. Their first reaction was that maybe Lionel was mad. They had lost count of the number of times that Ana had burst into a fit of tears, mumbling something about how much Lionel must hate her now. Of course, all of this occurred long before her personality had been reset to 0. This was a large part of the reason that Ana's father didn't want her to meet with Lionel. Ana was in a very sensitive time period right now, and meeting someone who might say vile things to her as a form of lashing out would be greatly detrimental to her. Things were especially bad because Ana was currently internalizing so much about Lionel right now, though she did so unconsciously. The reason she had chosen the path of absolute logic was only because in her own twisted way of viewing things, this was how she could connect with Lionel. Ironically though, she didn't seem to take it to its logical conclusion. But this was only because her memories of her last interaction with Lionel held her back. Those memories told her that being with Lionel had caused her a lot of grief. So, as unimpressed as she was with Richard, she still let him court her as he pleased. Visit. For the best no_understanding experience, Ana's priorities as such had become logic first, then came her love of fighting, and finally it became growing strong. Those 3 things seemed benign, but when combined with someone who wanted to use reason even down to a fault, it could become very complicated very quickly. Surprisingly though, the harsh words and the fireworks they had expected from Lionel meeting Ana again simply didn't happen. Yuri and Savon also thought that it was possible that Lionel didn't want to implicate them in his troubles. In fact, the more they thought about it, the more it seemed that this made the most sense. But then, why was it that no one was moving? Shouldn't they be enraged by Lionel's actions? Shouldn't they be chasing him down now that the danger of his breakthrough had cleared? Why did it seem like they didn't dare to? Neither of them knew how to wrap their heads around this situation. They couldn't help but look toward Ana again, but she was still oddly silent. They couldn't grasp anything she was thinking. Of course, Seath was in an even worse position. He somehow felt like he was missing something important, something so important that it made his spine tingle. Suddenly his gaze sharpened. Crown Heir Viola. What was the name of this young man? Richard blinked. He hadn't said his name on purpose. Visit. For a better user experience, though the matters surrounding Eleanor's scandal had been pinned onto Gradier, his former fiercest competitor for the Crown Heir position, he still didn't want the Luxnix to drag up the truth of those matters. If he admitted that Lionel was, in fact, Lionel Morales, the very same Lionel Morales he had used to slander his mother, then it was possible for it to be drawn back to him. Richard frowned. But now that Seath had asked, he truly couldn't avoid it. He was already the crown heir anyway, and it wasn't like the families were entirely buddy-buddy. Some underhanded schemes were inevitable. He said, "His name is Lionel Morales." Richard didn't know what he expected from saying these words. But the reaction he got was so fierce that he almost coughed up blood. Seath's aura shot into the skies like a pillar, making it difficult for the fifth-dimensional existences around him to even stand properly, let alone breathe. Richard rapidly retreated, his expression flickering. He realized then that this was a bigger matter than he had initially thought, but how could it not be? This tidbit of information was actually what had allowed him to secure his crown heir position, and it was precisely it that buried his competition. The name Lionel Morales had been stricken from the Luxnix family records. In the history of the Luxnix, this had happened only a handful of times, and never to a child who couldn't even walk on his own at the time. How could there not be a big secret behind this? The latest _IP_SODIES are on _the website. Halt. Seath's voice boomed for several kilometers. His palm flipped over, a badge of some sort appearing in his hands. The moment it did, he tossed it into the air. An enormous commotion broke loose, a pillar of blinding light shooting into the skies. The expressions of several changed, especially those of highest standing like the rankers and the division heads. That badge was the Patriarch's emblem. In terms of rank, it was only beneath the Star Order emblem. When it was deployed, it had the authority not only to deploy the Feather Sword warriors, but the Star Order Council had the obligation to send representatives as well. With this emblem, the Patriarch essentially had 90% of the family's forces at their beck and call. Of course, the strongest forces were definitely those old monsters on the Star Order Council. But, in general situations, just a representative or two from them was enough to deal with most problems. It had been just over 2 decades since the last time the Patriarch's emblem was used. And now it seemed to have been deployed again. Yet, inexplicably, as though he hadn't heard a single thing, Lionel continued to walk. Maybe the only change was that a pair of pants had appeared to cover his lower half. His placid expression made it seem as though he was entirely in his own world. The latest _IP_SODIES are on _the website. Chapter 1139. Seath wasn't a fool. As things stood now, he and the Patriarch's faction were in a precarious position. Of course, his chair on the Star Order Council was practically set in stone, as was the case for every Patriarch before him. However, he simply wasn't satisfied with this. Of all the Patriarchs in Luxnix history, Seath would not only be the one with the shortest tenure, but he would also be, by far, the most emasculated. Ever since Miguel began to show his talents, Seath had fallen by the wayside, and this crown heir of their family had become the de facto Patriarch. In fact, many of Seath's roles in the family now were the very same roles he had had as the former crown heir. It was nothing short of humiliating to an extreme. While he was sweating over the daily tasks of the family, Miguel lived a life of leisure. He had all the resources he could ever want, all the access he could ever want, and even had certain clearances that Seath himself couldn't easily access. Seath had worked his whole life for the sake of claiming the Patriarch position, but everything he had dreamed and pined for was put on the back burner for a junior who didn't seem to care very much for the family to begin with. He couldn't understand why those old bastards couldn't see it. Miguel had no family in the Luxnix, he at most had thin blood ties twice or thrice removed. Among all those who called themselves Luxnix in the main family, he was probably the most detached, and he had clearly made it a point not to form ties that were too close to anyone else. However, the Star Order Council were blinded by his talent. Not only had they chosen Miguel over Lionel, but what Seath cared the most about was the fact they had actually chosen Miguel over him. They practically stripped his position of all the power it was worth. He was nothing more than a figurehead for his own family, a happy face to show to outsiders. The latest _IP_SODIES are on _the website. In his youth, he had had dreams of eradicating the Viola and Montex families, claiming the entirety of the sector for the Luxnix. But he had practically been castrated. Everything in the family had entered a state of hibernation, all for the sake of Miguel and his maturation process. Quite frankly, Seath could never hate Lionel as much as he hated Miguel and the Star Order Council. So why had he released such a signal? Well, wasn't it obvious? He hoped that whoever it was that was protecting Lionel in the shadows could make these bastards suffer. Only in this sort of chaos could he have the chance to rise again and become the Patriarch that he was always meant to be. It seemed that in the years of arrogance the Luxniks had been fostering, they had been brewing animosity within their own borders. And from more than one person at that. Bang! The moment pillar rose up, it smashed into an invisible dome above. The instant the Patriarch's emblem had activated, so too had the protective force art of the Luxniks estate. Visit. For a better user experience, beautiful and complex hieroglyph-like formations crawled through the skies, shimmering in golds, whites and silvers as the call of a bird resounded. The pillar of light splitting into countless pieces. All across the Luxniks estate, thousands of feather sword warriors were alerted, the pins on their lapels lighting up one after another. Their expressions only had time to turn serious before they all vanished as one. Back in the location of the battlefield, the blinding lights only seemed to continue. The number grew in size, the vague outline of several figures taking form. By the time it all faded, the feather sword warriors all stood proud and tall. Of course, this number only included those that were currently in the estate and hadn't been deployed. In addition, there were no 12-point feather sword warriors in sight, as they were the personal guard of the Star Order Council. However, this lineup alone seemed to breathe pressure into the air. Patriarch. The feather sword warriors all respectfully saluted at once. The booming sound of their voices even dwarfed Seath's earlier shout. However, Seath made no move to command them. He was waiting for something in specific. He wasn't going to send these feather sword warriors off to their death, that would do him no good. What he needed was visit. For a better user experience at that moment, a mountainous pressure descended from the skies. Whether by coincidence, an illusion, or maybe reality, the protective barrier of the estate seemed to glow with a fiercer light, even as the concentration of snow force more than doubled in an instant. In the skies, standing upon what seemed like nothing, an old man with a flowing white beard and hair appeared. His ancient robes fluttered in the skies and his sharp eyes scanned the battlefield, taking it all in an instant. His hunched back did nothing to take away from his momentum. Who dares attack my Luxniks family? The momentum dwarfed anything Seath or the feather sword warriors could match. This man would have been very familiar to anyone who had been at the gate several weeks ago. This man was none other than the Star Order elder that had sided with Sparking Star Order, Winged Star Order. The old man seemed to deduce that all of this was caused by Lionel in an instant, the thinking speed of a sixth-dimensional expert with such strong internal sight being far beyond what most could imagine. He immediately locked onto Lionel, his pressure falling down in waves. However, what he could have never expected was for that pressure to vanish like a refreshing spring breeze just before it could reach Lionel, and right as a light sigh rang through the air. Lionel, who hadn't turned his head back even once since he began to walk forward, even after all the oppressive auras rising to his back, was suddenly forced to stop his steps. Before him, an older woman wearing fluttering white robes stood. A cane of pristine white wood supported her right side, and though her face was covered in the wear of age, it still carried the delicate touch of beauty. Visit. For a better user experience, she gazed toward Lionel with a complicated look, her eyes filled with regret, remorse and sadness. For a moment, it seemed that everything had frozen. Chapter 1140. Empress Fox's gaze twinkled. This was the first time she was seeing her grandson in over 20 years. It was difficult for her to reconcile her emotions all at once. She couldn't help but cast her internal sight toward Noah as well, but when it came to the guilt she held on her shoulders, it was mostly related to Lionel. While she felt terrible about not being able to be a part of Noah's life the way she should have been, her negligence had almost led to Lionel's death. Her negligence was just one matter. Anyone could make the mistake of trusting the wrong person or people. However, the way she dealt with those matters after finding out ended up alienating the entirety of her family. Her husband wanted nothing to do with her. Her daughter could hardly meet her gaze without resentment leaking through. Her son-in-law couldn't stand to even be on the same planet as her. And the family she had sacrificed so much to protect seemed to show her day after day why they weren't worthy of her giving up much of anything. Empress Fox's hand trembled as it rose to Lionel's cheek. In the air it seemed so very fragile. Despite the sheer strength of the woman who owned it, it felt as though the slightest gust of wind might cause it to collapse. It was only after her frail hand touched Lionel's face that it managed to gain some stability. However, the scalding heat of Lionel's skin didn't escape her attention at all. It felt as though it would burn her completely to ash, but she refused to take her hand away. Empress Fox looked up and into Lionel's eyes. There, she found a gaze that was impossible to read. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. While everyone else saw indifference and apathy, Empress Fox saw something deeper. She could see that Lionel had been scarred by something. The realization made her heart squeeze with an inescapable pang. She could tell that this emotion was completely unrelated to her. Maybe it really was most accurate to say that Lionel met her with indifference. In fact, he couldn't be bothered to snap out of his previous headspace to register the fact that it was his grandmother before him. Empress Fox didn't blame Lionel in the slightest. All she felt was a surging will to protect him. This was her grandson, her baby boy. She would rather suffer through him looking toward him with indifference for the rest of her life so long as he didn't have to suffer any pain or trouble. Empress Fox's thumb lightly rubbed Lionel's cheeks, her eyes holding back tears she didn't want to shed. Northern Star Order, what is the meaning of this? Winged Star Order's voice was tinged with his frown. The name Northern Star Order spoke for itself. There were two categories of titles given to those who joined the Star Order Council. The first were unique names. These were decided by your method of battle, your ability, or any other unique affinities or proclivities you might have. But there was a second category of titles altogether. These were known as hegemonic titles. Visit. For the best no_vel_ed_ng experience, hegemonic titles were passed down from generation to generation, though not so simply. It wasn't rare for a hegemonic title to skip over a generation entirely. In fact, to say it wasn't rare was a misnomer because it was, in practice, quite common for this to happen. In truth, even many of the Star Order Council were in the dark about how these hegemonic titles came about and what exactly their origins were. Only those who inherited the title would become privy to the information that came with it. Within the Luxnix family, there were only 3 hegemonic titles. The first was Snow Star Order. The second was Y Star Order. And the final and most powerful of them was Northern Star Order. Empress Fox generation had been greatly blessed. For the first time in Luxnix history, 2 hegemonic titles appeared in the same generation. And the most fantastic part of it was that this was all predicted to happen by the most recent Y Star Order. 1 generation removed from Empress Fox, it was deduced by Y Star Order that the Luxnix would soon have a great rise in talent. Over the next 3 generations, they would enter a wellspring of prosperity that would allow them to finally step through the final threshold and leave the 6th dimension behind. At first, it was unknown just how true this prediction would be. However, in the very next generation, not only was Empress Fox born, but so was her close friend and the inheritor of the Snow Star Order title. It was unprecedented in the Luxnix family's history. Not only had it been more than 20 generations since the last Northern Star Order appeared, but to think that it would appear alongside a Snow Star Order. The family realized then that the fortune told by the Y Star Order was true and they began to prepare. Visit. For a better user experience, the so-called state of hibernation mentioned by Seath wasn't by accident, nor was it solely due to Miguel. For 2 generations now, the Luxnix had experienced an unprecedented boom in talent and they were overflowing. In truth, it could be said that they already had the strength to crush both the Viola and Montex family. But they still waited for the day the 3rd and final generation would mature. Then they would sweep through the world in one fatal swoop. Unfortunately, over the years they had made many mistakes. Their overconfidence, sometimes warranted but most times not, was tearing their family apart from the inside out. Too many had forgotten that this Northern Star Order of theirs even existed. Or more accurately, they too easily believed that she would simply fall in line just like she always had. But right now, Northern Star Order was no longer just that. She was a grandmother who had just sensed her grandson's pain. She no longer seemed to care about anything else. In fact, she completely ignored Winged Star Order. "Little Leo, what do you want to do?" Empress Fox spoke as though even if Lionel asked her for the moon, she would reach out and grab it. Lionel remained silent for a long while. A hint of sadness plagued Empress Fox's gaze. There was nothing that pained her more than her grandson being unwilling to rely on her. But, surprisingly, Lionel finally spoke. "I don't want to be here anymore." Lionel's voice was cold, indifferent and detached. And yet, to her, they were like the most beautiful melody she had ever heard. Visit. For a better user experience, Empress Fox finally couldn't hold back her tears any longer as they fell like droplets of rain gently sliding down delicate leaves. "Okay. Grandma will take you away." You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.